Cheryl, I got in.
On the train.
I did, yeah, I took the train. Yeah.
You did good.
Yeah. Where does he work? Oh, he does. What does he do? Oh, really? Just very just so oh, really? Yeah. Yeah.
Where did he ever go? Was he a diplomat in
Philippines, Argentina, Peru, Santa Monica, Syria. Yeah. And most of the Latin America. Because our kids were up
Back of your head is going to be 100 million. That's the back of my head. Is that what? I put that on Facebook. That's my head. I can't see it. It's my head. Right enough. If I do, I'll leave.
Yes, definitely. I think there's one there. Because Tim has tickets. I think maybe 7. It is more. It definitely is more. But it doesn't have one. Yeah, archery. Very close to there. We live like this school. Oh, it's, do you know where Water Elementary is? That area. Oh. That's where Charlotte lived too. Yeah, Long Beach.
The House Committee on the Judiciary will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. We welcome everyone to this morning's hearing on protecting America from assault weapons. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. Assault weapons have been repeatedly used as weapons of deadly violence on our citizens. In just the last 2 years, Las Vegas, Parkland, Pittsburgh, Poway, Gilroy, Midland, and Odessa have all seen horrible shootings, mass shootings, at the hands of a gunman with assault weapons. And only last month, we added El Paso and Dayton to the list of communities shattered by mass violence perpetrated by a gunman armed with assault weapons. Today's hearing is about whether America will tolerate weapons of war on our streets and in our neighborhoods. Simply put, civilian assault weapons are just semi-automatic versions of military weapons. They have no purpose but to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. By allowing killers to rapidly and repeatedly fire bullets at their human targets without stopping to reload, assault weapons are designed for maximum bloodshed. Although 7 states plus the District of Columbia have passed laws addressing assault weapons, these state laws have proven too easy to evade. This is one reason I support a national ban on assault weapons. For example, despite California's ban on assault weapons, a man was able to drive across the border into Nevada to buy an assault weapon, a 75-round high-capacity magazine plus 5 40-round magazines, and use this weapon to kill 3 people and wound 17 others in a matter of minutes at the Gilroy Garlic Festival. A gunman intent on killing, whether the target is one person or many, can hop over state lines, buy a gun, and return to kill others. We must examine this dangerous problem and how to address it. The 1994 federal assault weapons ban, which expired in 2004, was a watershed event that offers an important guide for our efforts today. Recent studies of the effectiveness of that law have shown that mass shooting fatalities were 70% less likely to occur compared to the periods before and after the ban. Another study found that the federal assault weapons ban was associated with a 25% drop in gun massacres and a 40% drop in fatalities. The ban, however, was not without its shortcomings. During the ban, the gun industry, as usual, putting profits over morality, boasted of its ability to modify various assault weapons so that they were technically legal, but were still deadly instruments of mass killing. Writing of one AK-47 clone, Gun World magazine crowed, quote, in spite of assault rifle bans, bans on high-capacity magazines, the rantings of the anti-gun media, and the rifle's innate political incorrectness, the Kalashnikov, in various forms and guises, has flourished. Today, there are probably more models, accessories, and parts to choose from than ever before, close quote. Thus, boasting about how to evade the law, a law intended to protect human lives. As we consider how best to address the problem of assault weapons, we must examine the loopholes of the 1994 law that weakened its effectiveness. Although the lethal impact of assault weapons is horribly evident in mass shootings, assault weapons present a far broader problem. These weapons pose a daily threat to our communities, whether or not their use in particular instances cause mass casualties or make national news. They hold particular appeal to criminals who can wield terror with them, even without causing loss of life on a wide scale. For too long, the response in Congress to the daily toll of gun violence in our streets, in our schools, and in places of worship has been moments of silence. That has changed. Earlier this year, this committee reported, and the House passed, legislation to expand and improve our background check system. And this committee recently approved bills to establish systems for extreme risk protection orders, ban large capacity magazines, and prohibit individuals convicted of hate crime misdemeanors from possessing firearms. We will soon discover whether the Republican leadership of the Senate is still in abject fealty to the gun manufacturers or not when they consider this legislation. Today's hearing continues the important task of addressing our shameful national problem of gun violence. Today, we will discuss assault weapons and examine options for dealing with these particularly dangerous weapons of war. And tomorrow, our Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security will conduct a hearing concerning community responses to gun violence in our cities. We must take a comprehensive approach to solving the national crisis of gun violence, an issue that for too long has been ignored by national leaders. We know that the American people want us to examine the facts and to find solutions, and this hearing is an important step towards that goal. I would like to recognize the survivors and advocates here today, including those from Newton, Parkland, March for Our Lives, and Moms Demand Action. I thank you for your tireless advocacy. You inspire us all. I thank our witnesses for appearing today, and I look forward to their testimony. I understand that the ranking member is on his way. We will proceed to witness testimony at this time. I will recognize the ranking member for his opening statement when he arrives. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I will now introduce today's witnesses. The Honorable Nan Whaley is the mayor of Dayton, Ohio. Since the mass shooting in Dayton this past August, Mayor Whaley has been a leading advocate for gun safety legislation. Before joining city government, Mayor Whaley served on the Montgomery County Board of Elections and as a deputy to the Montgomery County Auditor. She received her BA from the University of Dayton and her MPA from Wright State University. Dr. Alejandro Rios Tovar, did I get that right? Dr. Alejandro Rios Tovar is a surgeon at Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center at El Paso. After the mass shooting attacks at a Walmart in El Paso, Dr. Rios Tovar treated victims of the shooting. He received his MD from the University of Texas School of Medicine at San Antonio. Dr. Rachel Brackney, did I get that right? Dr. Rachel Brackney is the Chief of Police of Charlottesville, Virginia. Previously, Dr. Brackney served for 30 years with the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police and served as the Chief of Police of the George Washington University. She was also the first African-American woman to oversee a Special Operations Division. Dr. Brackney received her BA and MA from Carnegie Mellon University and her PhD from Robert Morris University. She was also a graduate of the FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia. Kristen Rand is the Legislative Director for the Violence Policy Center. Before joining the Violence Policy Center in 1994, Ms. Rand served as a counsel with the Consumers Union. Ms. Rand received her BA from the University of Southern California and her JD from George Washington University. Amy Swearer is a senior legal policy analyst in the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Previously, she held positions with the Charles Koch Institute and the Lancaster County, Nebraska Public Defender's Office. She received her Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice and her JD from the University of Nebraska. Diana Muller is the founder of the DC Project, a grassroots initiative to bring one woman from every state to Washington, D.C. each year to meet with legislators on behalf of gun owners. She is also a co-host of Shooting Gallery on the Outdoor Channel. Previously, she served for 22 years in the Tulsa Police Department. Ms. Muller received a Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice and Psychology from the University of Central Missouri. David Chipman is a senior policy advisor at Giffords Law Center and is a member of the Firearms Committee of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Prior to assuming his current positions, Mr. Chipman served for 25 years as a special agent for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Mr. Chipman received his BA from American University and his master's in management from Johns Hopkins University. We welcome all our distinguished witnesses and we thank them for participating in today's hearing. Now, if you'd please rise, I will begin by swearing you in. Raise your right hand. What happened? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? You may be seated, and thank you. Let the record show the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Please note that each of your written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, there is a timing light on your table. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals your 5 minutes have expired. Mayor Whaley, you may begin.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler. On August 4th at 1 a.m., Dayton's Oregon District was bustling like it usually is with a diverse group of friends and neighbors enjoying a night out. People hopped between bars and restaurants as last call approached. Others waited in line at a popular taco truck for a late night snack. But that all changed in an instant. At 1:05 a.m., a young man armed with an AR-15 pistol variant walked down an alley between two bars and began spraying high-velocity rounds into the crowd. He then turned down a crowded street as people tried to run for safety. Friends pulled each other into doorways to try to escape falling bullets. One man threw his girlfriend to the ground and covered her body with his own. People literally ran out of their shoes. Less than a minute later, 9 people were dead and 17 others had been shot. Dozens more were injured in the commotion. 32 seconds. In just 32 seconds, 26 people had been shot, 9 families had lost loved ones, and dozens more will never be the same. The entire incident was over in half as much time as I've been speaking to you so far today. In those 32 seconds, the shooter's weapon did exactly what it was designed to do: kill or injure as many people as possible in the shortest amount of time. It was a weapon designed to inflict maximum damage to human beings. It left a trail of destruction, not on some foreign battlefield, but down a historic brick street in Dayton, Ohio. I visited the crime scene the morning after the shooting, And the thing I remember most clearly is the smell of bleach. A street sweeper was being used to try to clean the road, and men in hazmat suits were scrubbing the sidewalks. The meat still sat on the grill of the taco truck. Little yellow placards showing where bullet casings were found looked like they had been scattered without thought. I was in a place that was both completely familiar and completely foreign. The shooting occurred nearly 2 months ago, but our sidewalks are still stained after even numerous power washes. Many buildings and street signs still have bullet holes in them. And these are just the physical scars left by the shooting. Young people who were in the district that night talk about their new fear of crowds. Bartenders in the neighborhood are consumed with anxiety at the sound of sirens. Neighbors dread the sound of fireworks after being awakened by gunfire. Our whole city is hurting, all because a young man with a history of violent ideas could get his hands on a weapon capable of such destruction. And yet, we are lucky. Just 32 seconds after the shooting began, Dayton police neutralized the gunman. He was killed as he attempted to enter a bar where hundreds of people were hiding. If he shot 26 people on the street in 32 seconds, what could he have done in that bar? We are so lucky that 7 Dayton police officers were less than a block away when the shooting began. We are so lucky that these officers relied on their training and their courage and ran directly into the gunfire. I have thought a lot about the bravery of the Dayton police and the impossible situation that confronted them. Why do we ask our first responders to face down weapons that can do so much damage in so little time? Our city has honored these heroes. The White House has honored these heroes. But if we are serious about honoring and thanking our brave first responders, the best thing we can do is make sure they are never put in this situation again. Police should not have to confront a weapon that can kill 9 people in 32 seconds. No one should. The evening after the shooting, thousands of people gathered for a vigil on the same street where 9 of their neighbors had died only hours earlier. When Governor Mike DeWine took the stage, hundreds of people shouted in frustration, "Do something. Do something." The massacre that happened in Dayton and has happened into too many communities across this country demands a response. We must ensure that no American, neither a young person on a casual night out nor a police officer on patrol, has to face down weapons capable of so much destruction. I'm here today on behalf of the citizens of Dayton and mayors across the country to ask you to keep weapons like this off of our streets. I'm here to ask you to do something. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Tovar.
Chairman Nadler, Vice Chair Scanlon, Ranking Member Collins, and distinguished members of the House Judiciary Committee, thank you for the opportunity to come before you today and to participate in this hearing. I've been a trauma surgeon and the Associate Trauma Medical Director at the University of Medical Center of El Paso for the past 2 years. On the Saturday morning of August the 3rd, I just finished a typical 30-hour shift at the hospital with the usual gallbladder surgery. I picked up a McDonald's on the way home, looking forward to eating, getting some sleep, until Sunday morning when I'd have to do all over again. Just after I got home at 10:55 a.m., I received a text message from my chairman of surgery who was out of town. Active shooter, Walmart, unknown number of victims. Honestly, I didn't think much of it. I had an active shooter alert the month earlier, and the SWAT team only brought in 1 victim at the time. Dr. Susan McLean, my mentor and the trauma surgeon in the hospital, could surely handle this. A text 2 minutes later was sent to all surgeons in our group. If anybody is in El Paso, go to the hospital. There's an active shooter and we'll get at least 4 or 5 victims. By the time this text was sent, I would learn later, the shooting was over in just about 20 minutes, and more than 20 people were killed, more than 20 were injured, and countless lives would be changed. I ran red lights and sped to the hospital. I knew that most of these patients would require immediate surgery, and I was trying to coordinate who would be there to help operate. By the time I arrived, each of our 6 trauma bays had patients each needed surgery. Dr. McLean was already in the operating room with one of them. The one that drew my attention was a patient with CPR in progress. She had been talking just a few minutes before, and now from a shoulder wound, she was lifeless. My resident and I quickly and methodically cut open her chest to begin manual cardiac compressions. 3 liters of blood immediately spilled to the floor, and after working for several minutes, I knew our efforts were futile, and I had to pronounce the time of death. Just 10 minutes after I arrived to the hospital. The look of disappointment in my resident's eyes ate at me, but I couldn't process that now. We had more to do. I'm not a military surgeon, but what I saw looked like a war zone. Small gunshot wounds in the legs amounted to huge areas of cavitation and exit wounds larger than a grapefruit. I'd never seen anything like this before. How could a firearm create this type of destruction? The next woman I treated was calmer than the rest. She had a third of her pelvis shattered into dozens of pieces. Multiple holes in her large and small intestine were too extensive to be repaired. In damage control surgery, decisions have to be made to remove parts of intestine instead of sewing the holes closed when there are more pressing issues to be addressed. In this case, it was clear that none of this intestine could be salvaged. We packed with temporary dressing when she was stabilized and planned to return to surgery in a day or two to reassess for any missed injuries. I have treated countless patients with gunshot wounds from small firearms. In those cases, sometimes it's even difficult to find the holes because of how small they are and the clean-cut appearance that it looks like a pencil made them. Here, it was not so. We had 14 patients come in the span of 34 minutes. The other main hospital in town received 11 patients. 7 of our patients went straight to the OR for surgery in that single hour, and most had to return to the operating room several more times. And their journey is still not done. In the next few months, temporary colostomies, multiple orthopedic types of procedures will have to be reperformed and reversed and closed. In the aftermath, 22 people lost their lives that day. We did save 13 out of the 14 patients that arrived to us. But that first patient haunts me every night. I wish I could have done more, and I blame myself for her death. I saw her autopsy recently to try and get some closure. She was protecting her child, and so she was actually shot in the back and through her shoulder. She had a hole the size of a baseball at the top of her lung. Her subclavian vessels were essentially non-existent. If this injury had been caused by a smaller firearm, she may have had a chance at survival, but there's absolutely nothing I could do to fix that kind of devastating injury. I hope that she died knowing that she protected her child from the same fate. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Chief Brackney.
Committee Chairman, Representative Gerald Nadler, Ranking Member, Representative Collins, and members of the U.S. House of Representatives, Committee on the Judiciary. I bring you greetings on behalf of the Executive Board and members of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, NOBLE. As you know, my name is Dr. Rochelle Brackney. I am a member of NOBLE and the Chief of Police for the Charlottesville Police Department in Charlottesville, Virginia, and all that that brings with it. It is an honor for NOBLE to provide written testimony on the topic of protecting America from assault weapons. NOBLE is very concerned about the level of gun violence in the United States, and specifically the correlation between violence and the proliferation of assault weapons and high-capacity ammunition magazines. It is our organization's opinion that violence, particularly gun violence, is a public health issue. And as with all public health issues, it demands a comprehensive, non-judgmental, pragmatic, evidence-based approach to saving lives and reducing injury. NOBLE, along with other organizations such as the National Law Enforcement Partnership to Prevent Gun Violence, of which we are a member, is committed to addressing the pervasive nature of gun violence and its horrific impact on the communities across America. Specifically, firearm-related injuries and deaths to include homicides, suicides, and accidental shootings involving assault weapons is unacceptable and demands immediate action. To be clear, Noble defines assault weapons as semi-automatic guns with a high-capacity ammunition magazine designed for military use. We advocate for limiting high-capacity ammunition magazines to 10 rounds and the regulation of new semi-automatic assault weapons. In 2016, assault weapons accounted for 1 in 4 police officers killed in the line of duty through gun violence. Noble supported the Public Safety and Recreational Firearms Use Protection Act, or the Federal Assault Weapons Ban, AWB of 1994, and the Federal Assault Weapons Ban Reauthorization Act of 2004. We currently support H.R. 8, which is a bipartisan background check act of 2019, as does 90% of all Americans. Assault weapons have been used in many mass shootings, such as Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, the Tree of Life Synagogue shooting, the Las Vegas Music Festival shooting, and in El Paso. We believe the level and the lethality of gun violence directed at police officers and our communities requires an organized and aggressive response from policymakers at the federal, state, and local levels. Elected officials must commit to closing gaps in the current regulatory system, including those that enable felons, minors, and other prohibited persons to access firearms, and those that allow the trafficking of illegal guns. Law enforcement plays a central and critical role in preventing gun violence and solving crime. Effective strategies for the strict enforcement of laws concerning the illegal possession, trafficking, and criminal use of firearms are vital, and we need to be supported by data, research, technology, training, and best practices. Because the public's health and safety depend on the efforts of law enforcement, agencies must have resources sufficient to prioritize the protection of officers and communities against guns and firearm violence. The crisis of gun violence in our country necessitates a sustained, coordinated, and collaborative effort involving citizens, elected officials, law enforcement, and the entire criminal justice system. On behalf of the law enforcement leaders of Noble, we thank you for supporting law enforcement and our ability to maintain public safety while continuing to address the health issue of gun violence. Our members stand ready to meet the needs of our communities and the nation's, and we thank you for the opportunity for you to do the same.
Thank you very much. Ms. Rand?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for hearing the views of the Violence Policy Center. We're a national educational organization working to reduce gun violence. Generally, semi-automatic assault weapons are civilian versions of military assault weapons. Semi-automatic assault weapons look the same as their military counterparts because they are virtually identical, save for one feature. Military assault weapons are machine guns capable of fully automatic fire. Assault weapons did not just happen. They were developed to meet well-defined combat needs. The most significant assault weapon functional design feature is the ability to accept a detachable ammunition magazine. The gun industry introduced semi-automatic versions of military assault weapons in order to create and exploit new civilian markets for these deadly weapons. The gun industry began to aggressively market assault weapons in the 1980s. And although the gun lobby today argues there's no such thing as a civilian assault weapon and now euphemistically refers to them as modern sporting rifles, the industry and gun magazines enthusiastically describe these civilian versions as assault rifles, assault pistols, and military assault weapons to boost civilian sales throughout the 1980s. The industry's marketing of assault weapons has intensified as the market for traditional hunting and sporting firearms has waned. Today's militarized gun industry is focused primarily on developing and marketing increasingly lethal assault weapons. The gun industry's marketing campaigns stress that semi-automatic assault weapons available to civilians are the equivalent of those used by the military. The industry's marketing materials are replete with military images and language. I'll just give you one example from FN's 2019 catalog. Our tactical firearms are the stuff of legend. Every innovation is born in the battlefront, built for the home front. The rise of public mass shootings directly coincides with the increasing availability of assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. Prior to the 1980s, the United States very rarely experienced the trauma of a public mass shooting. That began to change in 1984 when James Huberty decided he wanted to go hunting for humans at a McDonald's in San Ysidro, California. Huberty wielded an Uzi carbine and killed 21 and wounded 19. Now these assault weapon attacks are coming with increasing frequency and higher death tolls. The impact of the industry's intensifying focus on military-style firearms can be seen in the weapons chosen by today's mass shooters. For example, the shooter who killed 9 and wounded 27 in Dayton chose an AR-type assault pistol equipped with a stabilizing brace, a relatively new trend in industry innovation. A major point I would like to make, and given this opportunity, is that assault weapons are not just about mass shootings. The threat posed by these weapons is much broader than that. And in fact, they pose a significant risk to law enforcement. The Violence Policy Center performed an analysis of unpublished information from the FBI and determined that 1 out of 5 law enforcement officers slain in the line of duty in 2016 and 2017 were killed with assault weapons. In addition, assault weapons are the clear weapons of choice of cross-border gun traffickers supplying criminal organizations in Mexico and other Latin American countries. We have an ongoing project looking at the firearms seized in the context of these types of trafficking prosecutions and found that 55% of the 6,000 firearms named in trafficking prosecutions were assault weapons. And finally, assault weapons are used in street crime, which I'm sure you'll hear more from law enforcement today. I just quickly want to address some items with respect to policy. A ban, the definition must be very clear and something the industry cannot evade, and we must find a way to grapple with the grandfathered weapons. Those are the 2 major flaws with the 94 law, and we need those to be addressed. Thank you for considering my views.
Thank you very much, Ms. Swear.
Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Collins, and distinguished members of Congress. My name is Amy Swearer, and I am the Senior Legal Policy Analyst at the Heritage Foundation's Ed Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. Just as doctors can only recommend an effective treatment plan if they first form a correct diagnosis based on accurate assessment of the symptoms, policy analysts and policy makers must have an accurate understanding of the societal problems they are seeking to combat. Unfortunately, too many policymakers appear completely uninformed about basic factual realities related to guns and gun violence. Don't misunderstand me. We all want safer communities, but the characteristics distinguishing so-called assault weapons from non-assault weapons are not factors like caliber, lethality, or rate of fire. Proposals to ban scary-looking features like barrel shrouds or pistol grips are, for all intents and purposes, proposals to force law-abiding citizens to own guns that are harder for them to handle, harder to fire accurately, and more likely to cause them injuries, even when they are being used for lawful purposes. Moreover, semi-automatic rifles are not a meaningful driving factor behind rates of gun violence. 2/3 of gun deaths in this country are suicides, where the type of firearm is essentially irrelevant. With respect to gun crimes, over 90% are committed with handguns. Rifles of any kind are definitively used in only 3 to 4% of gun homicides every year, and an American citizen is 4 times as likely to be stabbed to death than they are to be shot to death with a rifle of any kind. Despite frequent claims that semi-automatic rifles are the weapon of choice for mass public shooters, in the last decade, over half of these shootings have been carried out with handguns alone. On the other hand, semi-automatic rifles like the AR-15 are so well suited for defensive action against threats in a civilian context that the Department of Homeland Security quite literally designates them as personal defense weapons for law enforcement officers. It is little wonder then that millions of law-abiding citizens in this country also choose these types of semi-automatic rifles as their own personal defense weapons. Far from needing to be protected from these rifles, law-abiding Americans benefit when they are allowed to defend themselves with them, particularly in situations where they are outnumbered. Just last week, a homeowner in Rockdale County, Georgia, relied on his scary-looking semi-automatic assault weapon to defend himself against 3 masked teens armed with at least 1 handgun who tried to rob him and other residents in their own front yard. Ironically, the rifle deemed an assault weapon by many in this room was used defensively to protect innocent people against assault, while the perpetrators used a non-assault weapon offensively to commit actual assault. Importantly, some of the most famous examples of the defensive use of assault weapons by civilians come from scenarios where the government has been either unable or unwilling to defend entire communities from large-scale civil unrest. During the 1992 LA riots, for example, law enforcement was nowhere to be found as hundreds of looters ransacked Koreatown. Ordinary store owners like Richard Ree and his employees took it upon themselves to defend their livelihoods from lawlessness, using, in many cases, semi-automatic rifles. Similar stories emerged during the civil unrest in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. There are some here today who still genuinely don't understand why or how anyone would need such scary-looking rifles for purposes other than mass murder. And so I have permission from my mother to explain it to you by partially embarrassing her. My mother did not grow up with firearms, and they will never be her favorite thing in the world. In fact, she'd never handled a firearm until I took her to the range for the first time several years ago. Now, I love my mother, but like every other novice with a handgun, she was quite bad. I mean, she struggled to hit a stationary target from 6 yards out under ideal conditions. And then she picked up an AR-15. And I watched my mother put a fist-sized grouping of lead in the center mass of a target from 20 yards out. That is why law-abiding citizens buy millions of these firearms. When accuracy and stopping power matter, they are simply better. Americans use firearms to defend themselves between 500,000 and 2 million times every year. God forbid that my mother is ever faced with a scenario where she has to stop a threat to her life. But if she is, I hope politicians protected by professional armed security didn't strip her of the right to use the firearm she can handle most competently. Frankly, I hope she has in her hands the scariest looking assault weapon she can find, so that we can both be confident in her ability to end the threat. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mueller.
Details. Thank you, Chairman Nadler and Ranking Member Collins. I'll acknowledge him even though he's not here, and committee members. My name is Diana Mueller, and I'm an ordinary American, one who has had different life experiences that bring me here today as a dissenter of any new gun control laws, including the assault weapons ban. After 22 years as a police officer with assignments that included patrols, street crimes, gangs, and narcotics, I retired to focus on a second career as a professional shooter, and I've had the honor to represent our country on an international stage. 4 years ago, I came to this town as a tourist, and during a haphazard meeting with my congressman, I asked if there was anything I should be doing to dispel the information about guns and gun owners that's running rampant on Capitol Hill. From there, the DC Project was born, an educational and nonpartisan effort of 50 women, one from every state, meeting their legislators as gun owners and Second Amendment supporters. We are as diverse as any cross-section of America. Many of our women, like victims of these mass public murders, have endured unspeakable violence themselves or lost loved ones. Their stories are similar to Kate Nixon's. It was reported that Kate knew her coworker was unstable and felt that he would shoot up the place. Her husband encouraged her to take a pistol to work, but she didn't want to break the rules. She followed the policy that was supposed to keep her safe, a gun-free zone, and she was murdered the next day in the Virginia Beach tragedy. These laws and policies are taking away a woman's right to choose. Gun rights are women's rights. That's why I'm honored to be here today, to be a voice for the millions of Americans who share, American women who share my ideology, but are not represented in mainstream media or squelched on social media. As a woman, I'm likely smaller and less equipped for violence than an attacker, or if I'm outnumbered by people who may do me harm, my firearm is the great equalizer and levels the playing field. I married late in life, and I spent the majority of my adult life sleeping by myself. There were so many nights that there were bumps in the nights, and I'm sure it's happened to you guys, but I have a peace because I have a firearm by my side, specifically an AR-15. I own and carry firearms not to take a life, but to protect a life. I am worth protecting. My family is worth protecting. So why does anybody need an AR-15? Let me explain it in shoes. You wouldn't run a marathon in dress shoes, and you wouldn't go to a formal ball in sneakers. Similarly, each of my firearms have a specific purpose. The AR-15 just falls in the category of that really comfortable dressy shoe that gets called on many occasions. It's my go-to for home defense and vehicle gun. As a competitor, I've turned a hobby into a living, and my husband hunts with an AR. The AR-15 platform is the most popular general purpose rifle because it's the most versatile and most customizable. And freedom doesn't ask why the need. To quote William Pitt the Younger, necessity is the plea for every infringement on human freedom. It is the argument of tyrants. It is the creed of slaves. For 22 years, I enforced the laws you created, and I had a front row seat to the justice system. It's frustrating to see the revolving door where prosecutors reduce or drop charges and judges give minimal sentencing. I find it ironic in today's effort of criminal justice reform that you are taking steps to be lenient on people who've actually committed crimes against laws you've already created, while at the same time proposing more laws that turn ordinary law-abiding citizens like myself into criminals. How about holding the people accountable for the laws that are already on the books before we pass any further legislation that would only be a burden on the law-abiding? If these laws were the answer, Chicago, Baltimore, LA, and even this city would be the safest city in America. The firearms community is #doing something. We are leading the way on meaningful safety measures. I implore you, work with us instead of demonizing us. Law-abiding American gun owners are not the enemy. Help our community promote programs like Project Child Safe, Eddie Eagle, and the Kids Safe Foundation that teaches kids about firearm safety. Faster Saves Lives and School Shield are school security programs. And Walk the Talk America is suicide prevention programs. These are initiatives that are being driven by the firearms industry. If you really want to make a difference in gun-related deaths, get behind these programs and fund them, because we believe one life unjustifiably taken is one life too many. Let's put firearms education back in schools and start protecting our kids like we protect the people in this building. Education over legislation. Thank you for your time to speak. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for your time and your service.
Thank you, Mr. Chipman.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for letting me testify today. My name is David Chipman, and I am the Senior Policy Advisor at Giffords, the gun violence prevention organization founded by former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. I am a gun owner, and I served as a special agent for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives for 25 years. Throughout my ATF career, I served on the front lines of our government's efforts to prevent violent crime and effectively regulate the firearms industry. I worked to disrupt firearms trafficking conspiracies along the Iron Pipeline, served on ATF's SWAT team, and later was the special agent in charge of the agency's firearms programs. My time as a federal law enforcement officer taught me that although all weapons can be dangerous in the wrong hands, some weapons are particularly lethal and should be more strictly regulated. Our nation's current gun violence crisis has made two things very clear. One, it is far too easy for violent people to get their hands on deadly weapons. And two, the American people overwhelmingly want Congress to act now to make their communities safer. Assault weapons are a class of semi-automatic firearms originally intended for military use, designed to kill people quickly and efficiently. These weapons are often the weapon of choice for mass shooters. Assault weapons like the semi-automatic AR-15 I used on ATF SWAT team are configured so that a shooter can fire accurately and rapidly. Most importantly, they can accept detachable magazines. There is virtually no limit to the possible size of a magazine. This enables the shooter to continue firing as many as 100 rounds without having to stop and reload, maximizing the casualties in a shooting. Absent the ability to fire automatically, these weapons are identical to those used by the military. The public and many lawmakers, including many on this committee, have called for a renewal of the 90s era assault weapons ban. As an ATF special agent charged with enforcing that law, I can say with confidence that there were both benefits and limitations. The 1994 Act had a positive effect on public safety. Research indicates that during the 10-year period the federal assault weapons ban was in effect, mass shooting fatalities were 70% less likely to occur compared to the periods before and after the ban. The 1994 Act suffered from notable limitations. The law did not regulate the transfer or possession of assault weapons manufactured before the law's effective date. Manufacturers took advantage of this loophole by boosting production of assault weapons in the months leading up to the ban. Consequently, while the law was in place, assault weapons were regularly resold through private transactions, undermining its effectiveness. However, we rarely saw the kinds of mass shootings we're seeing today. Since the assault weapons ban expired in 2004, the gun industry has continued to design and sell more dangerous weapons. For instance, during the 1990s, assault pistols like the Tech-9 fired 9mm handgun rounds. Modern AR and AK pistols like the weapon used in Dayton and earlier this year to kill a Milwaukee police officer fire rifle rounds. We currently do not have a reliable count of how many assault weapons are in circulation. Estimates are in the tens of millions. If our goal is to balance the rights of responsible law-abiding gun owners and the urgent need to keep particularly dangerous weapons out of the hands of criminals, simply reinstating the 90s era ban on assault weapons is not enough. One option would be to require the registration of all existing assault weapons in civilian hands under the National Firearms Act, while banning the future manufacture and sale of these firearms. The NFA was enacted in response to violent gun crimes and the deaths of law enforcement officers during the 1930s. The NFA imposes an excise tax and registration requirement to possess certain weapons, including silencers, sawed-off shotguns, short-barreled rifles, machine guns, and other particularly dangerous firearms. In order to possess one of these weapons, applicants must pass a background check, provide fingerprints and a photo, pay a $200 transfer tax, and register their NFA weapon with ATF. Using the NFA to address assault weapons would use an existing and effective regulatory structure that allows lawful ownership, while also addressing the public safety concerns. For more than 80 years, this regulatory system has worked effectively. Legally owned NFA weapons are rarely used in crime. I have built my career around the belief that it is possible to balance rights and responsibilities. I've stood in the face of danger to protect public safety carrying an assault weapon. It is simply unacceptable that military-style and high-powered weapons are so readily available to civilians today, and that they increasingly lead to loss of innocent lives. We can and should take action to make our communities safer. Thank you for considering my testimony today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. The ranking member, the gentleman from Georgia, has arrived and we'll hear his opening statement before we begin questioning under the 5-minute rule. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your indulgence today. Thanks for holding this hearing on the so-called assault weapons. Let's hope that today's hearing, we'll all have a better understanding of these types of rifles and how they are used in committing crimes, particularly murder. I hope we can also have an open and honest dialogue about the firearms my colleagues wish to ban. I hope we can avoid the rhetoric that has plagued this discussion for decades. Only when we are equipped with the facts can we mobilize to effectively prevent violent crime, a goal we all share. Let's first look at the term assault weapon and when the term entered the American lexicon. Many attribute the invention of the term to Josh Sugarman, the boss of one of our witnesses here today. In 1988, Mr. Sugarman stated, assault weapons, just like armor-piercing bullets, machine guns, and plastic firearms, are a new topic. The weapon's menacing looks, coupled with the public's confusion over fully automatic machine guns versus semi-automatic assault weapons, Anything that looks like a machine gun is assumed to be a machine gun, can only increase the chance of public support for restrictions on these weapons. In addition, few people can envision practical uses for these weapons. Assault weapons, however, are not assault rifles. Assault rifles are rapid-fire magazine-fed rifles designed for military use. They are shoulder-fired weapons that allow the shooter to select between settings: semi-automatic, requiring the operator to pull the trigger for each shot, and fully automatic, allowing the operator to hold the trigger as the gun fires continuously or in 3-shot bursts. As Mr. Sugarman's statement indicates, the so-called assault weapons are semi-automatic. They aren't assault rifles, and they can't be used as a fully automatic assault rifle. Semi-automatic firearms require you to pull the trigger each time for each shot, just as a pistol requires one trigger pull per shot. Unfortunately, many in the American public and the media, and shockingly in this body, do not understand the difference. We must understand what different firearms do and how they function if we want to have effective laws to prevent gun violence. I can't imagine anyone here today would advocate for legislation that does not actually make our families safer, but that's what I fear we're headed for. As one member of this committee has conflated the term assault rifle and assault weapon multiple times, dear colleagues, letter seeking support for a bill banning assault weapons. And as we dive into these conversations, let's clear up another popular misconception. The AR in AR-15 does not stand for assault rifle. Rather, it stands for Armalite Rifle Model 15. AR-15s are not assault rifles. They are semi-automatic firearms that function similarly to hunting rifles, where the operator pulls the trigger to fire each shot. The differences between these guns are largely cosmetic. Sadly, disinformation comes from many sources. A state senator from California, when speaking about an assault weapon, stated that right here has the ability of 30, and this is their term, not mine, a 30 caliber clip, should be a magazine, to disperse 30 bullets in a half a second. 30 magazine to disperse in a half second. Either that's a blatant misrepresentation or an indication of shocking ignorance. Even a fully automatic military-issued M4 cannot fire at such a rate. Another member of the committee stated that I've held an AR-15 in my hand. Wish I hadn't. It was as heavy as 10 boxes that you might be moving, and a bullet that is utilized is a 50 caliber. These kinds of bullets need to be licensed and do not need to be on the street. This is a brief statement that somehow manages to make several basic factual errors. An AR-15 weighs between 6 and 7 pounds, fires a .223 round of ammunition. It does not fire 50 caliber ammunition. Anyone who knows or discussed this about firearms would know that it is absurd to even suggest it. I hope that we can clear up these misconceptions in today's hearing, but my hopes are not high. However, when we have a Democratic presidential candidate say, hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, let's hope cooler and rational heads prevail here today. Finally, let's review how these so-called assault rifles are used in crime. Some estimate and calculate the number of assault weapons in private hands at around 10 million. In 2017, according to the FBI, there were 403 murders committed with all rifles, not just those deemed to be assault weapons. By comparison, knives and cutting instruments were used in 1,591 murders, blunt objects, clubs, hammers, bats, 467, hands, feet were used in 696 murders. At the same time, the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration found speeding killed 9,717 people, yet I do not see any of my colleagues advocating for the prohibition of a purchase or possession of a vehicle traveling more than 70 miles an hour. My friends, if we're going to have this debate, and we should, we must be honest with each other and take the time to learn basic facts about the items we're looking to ban, and also the result of what that might actually incur. That's not too much to ask, and hopefully the witnesses here today can assist with that task. With that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. We'll now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Rand, there are certain features that distinguish assault weapons from hunting rifles. Earlier this month, this committee reported out a bill by Representative Deutsch that would ban large capacity magazines. During the 1994 ban, people got around the ban by various means. How should we define an assault rifle that we might want to ban in order to get around the easy adaptability of such weapons by putting on various parts or some other way?
Thank you for your question, Chairman Nadler. I think the major problem with the 94 law is that it defined an assault rifle, for example, by the ability to take a detachable ammunition magazine, which is the most important, most deadly feature, and then required 2 additional listed assault rifle features, such as a pistol grip or a bayonet lug. And basically what the industry did was take off one of the more superfluous factors like a bayonet lug, but they could retain the pistol grip, which allows the shooter to have better control during rapid fire. So if we go to what's known as a 1 characteristics test and clearly define those characteristics that define an assault weapon, and assault weapons also include assault pistols and assault shotguns, then we'll be on much firmer footing.
And that would eliminate these weapons that we commonly refer to as assault weapons, and that can cause these mass casualties.
Yes, I believe that a good definition coupled with an effective magazine ban, you cannot overstate the importance of a magazine ban, would do the job to ban assault weapons.
Thank you. Mr. Chipman, assault weapons have become the favored weapon for many mass murders. These weapons are also preferred by individuals who commit crimes in our communities. What impact did the 1994 assault weapons ban have on improving public safety in general? And what could we expect if we repeated that in a more effective fashion?
I think there are 2 things involved. First, when looking at mass shootings, we see that 70% less likely to be killed in a mass shooting during that period. When I was at ATF, what I did see was an impact on the availability of assault pistols, which we were seeing more daily as a threat to everyday gun violence on the streets, things like the Tech 9. And I think that what we would expect to see in the future is similar declines over time. So it enhanced public safety. It certainly didn't make the streets more dangerous, which is often the claim if we didn't have those weapons available to the public.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Tovar, what does a gunshot wound from an assault weapon look like compared to a wound from a handgun? So what additional challenges did you face in the aftermath of the El Paso attack?
Again, according to my testimony, what I was saying that these large caliber cartridges, bullets, had serious cavitation greater than the size of my fist. That amounted to.
What does cavitation mean? What do you mean by that?
There's an effect not just with the bullets, but also a temporary cavitation effect with the kind of like a blast effect that's internal as well. With my experience with handgun gunshot wounds, which are traveling at a lower velocity, I see that it's straight through and through and not as significant as damage that can be readily identified, readily fixed in the operating room. I haven't seen anything like this before this mass shooting, and I haven't seen anything since then.
And that's because of the greater velocity of an assault rifle bullet?
That's my understanding, yes.
Thank you. And Mayor Whaley, I commend you for your leadership in the wake of the Dayton shooting. Beyond physical injuries or death, what effect did the mass shooting have on your community?
Thank you, Chairman. The effect has been long-term, particularly for the trauma that the community is dealing with even today. And other mayors experience this in their communities as well, like the mayor of Pittsburgh and Parkland, et cetera. Anytime another shooting happens in the country, the whole community goes through the shooting again. We've seen that already, unfortunately, with the Midland and Odessa shootings. And we know that the mental health work that we'll need to do will take years for us to really make sure that people have the services they need. This is an area of town where young people and people of a great diverse community come together. And, we're really concerned that they don't have, medical access to the mental health services they need. And we're trying to provide those even today.
Okay, thank you very much. My time has expired. I recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Muller, I have a question. Can you, just in general, what you've heard already this morning, some of the misconceptions that we frequently hear in this discussion surrounding what we call so-called the assault weapons?
I'll get this down before we end. Some of the things I've heard here today is we're talking about cosmetic things, and I disagree with what I've heard here today because a 22 rifle that everybody may have seen as a brown stock and something that your father may have given you, we can turn that into an AR platform and it look like an AR platform, and you would think that this is a weapon of war. These are cosmetic differences, and they do not make it any different.
Can I stop you right there for
Yes,
just a second? You just said something this often. Is it not true historically that all weapons come out of war? Then
Well,
why are we continuing to say that this is a weapon of war? All weapons come out of war.
Correct. Well, my point is that any firearm is lethal force. So our community is all about safety and trying to educate people into how to, being responsible gun owners. We're not for.
Well, I think the issue is here is when you came out, with the old Flint, muzzleloader, you come into the bolt action of the World War I, you come out, these were all started in, from a procession of protection and for enforcement, whether it be in law or in the war. They come from the idea that all of a sudden they jump from war to the streets is when they came home from World War I, they wanted to use what they had used in World War I. That's what they used for hunting. This is where it's progressed. Do assault rifles, another question here, assault rifles shoot any faster than any other semi-automatic firearm?
No, sir.
They don't. Is it, one of the issues is you served as a law enforcement officer during the time of the previous assault weapon ban from 94 to 2004. Did it have any impact on your safety as a law enforcement officer or those that you were sworn to serve and protect?
No, sir. I was before, during, and after the previous assault weapons ban, and I saw zero effect on me personally, and I believe the FBI statistics stated that it was ineffective, and therefore I believe you guys let it sunset.
All right, Ms. Ware, last week this committee passed on a party line vote a red flag law. Do you have any concerns with what this committee reported, and if so, what are they?
Thank you for your question. So I've written fairly extensively on red flag laws, and while I agree that there may be a place for targeted intervention for people who are objectively dangerous, whether due to mental illness or other reasons, there are serious concerns with policies such as the ones that have recently come out of this body. Part of that is a complete lack of due process. So we are talking about taking away, even temporarily, a fundamental constitutional right. There need to be very high burdens of proof. There need to be objective, narrow measures as to what's constituting dangerousness. There need to be, with regard to things like ex parte orders, quick follow-up, not allowing people to wait 30 days before they have their hearing after already infringing on their constitutional rights. We need to ensure that there are provisions for the restoration of those rights, and things like that are vitally important, and they are not measures that I've seen adequately imposed in many of these bills.
And I'm sure you followed this from last week, that we really took two bills and we did what we do up here a lot, and that's sandwich it into a same bill, and which created a lot of problems. And I think one of the issues was, jurisdictional influence, forum shopping. Is that something else that's concerning in this, from what was passed out here, to that actually would solve anything that we're looking at?
Well, so my understanding of the one that was passed is that it would essentially be state-type grants.
Well, it did until we added on the federal side of it.
Yeah, when we're looking at federal type of red flag laws, I mean, one of the big things should be follow-up in terms of like mental health treatment, ensuring that people have a route to, have their rights restored to them. And so part of the problem is jurisdictional. You don't have that at a federal level the way you do at a state level. And frankly, it's not really a federal jurisdictional type of issue.
And I appreciate that. And I appreciate, the conversation about the 22, the old 22. I can put as many bullets down as the old log, and I can shoot it quick as anything else. And it's 50 years old. It's not a brand new gun. Doctor, I appreciate what you do for your community. And I thank you for the unfortunate incident that you saw. As someone who was a part of our response in Iraq, I was in the hospital at Balad. I saw these, from IEDs and from everything else. And your testimony is very compelling on this. But isn't it true also that a .357 Magnum and with a hollow point bullet, or a .44 Magnum with a hollow point bullet, would also cause catastrophic damage, as just you have seen also from a...
To my understanding, yes, has cavitary lesions from those types of weapons as well.
So I guess if from your testimony on how bad this is, if you really want to do away with what you saw, you need to get rid of all guns, correct?
No.
I'm not advocating for anything like that. I'm just telling you what
I appreciate
what I
it,
see.
but they are similar, and I think that's the only point I was trying to make, is there are similar concussions from different guns, which nobody's talking about taking away up here. And I think they're very similar when you look at it. Thank you for your testimony. Again, thank you for your work. I yield back.
Ms. Lofgren, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On July 28th, a shooter in Gilroy used a Wassner Arrangements semi-automatic rifle called a WASR-10, which is a variant of an AK-47, and he had a 75-round drum magazine and 5 40-round magazines as he carried out his attack. Now, the sale of this firearm in high-capacity magazines are actually banned in California, but he went over to Nevada, bought them there, and brought them back to Gilroy. You know, he killed Stephen Romero, age 6, who lived in my district, and Kyla Salazar, who was 13, who lived in my district, and Trevor Irby, who's just 25, lived over in Santa Cruz, and he injured 17 others, and he did that in under 60 seconds because the Gilroy police, who were outgunned, actually ran up to him, and in less than a minute, they shot him, and then he shot him and killed himself. So I really am grateful to the Gilroy police officers, but I feel a need to take action so that you can't have a weapon that can do so much damage in under 60 seconds and kill innocent people who have a right to be able to go to a family-friendly festival and not be in fear of their lives. You know, after that, Mayor, I heard your testimony about the impact on a community. It's very real for the people who were there, for their neighbors, for their fellow parishioners and their friends, but really it's a whole community. The next weekend, there were family-friendly festivals that were canceled because people were afraid to go out in public. And so we have created here a situation where the kind of thing that I had growing up, where I could go to a park or a grocery store or walk down the street and not be afraid, that's not the case anymore. And we have an obligation to make sure that Americans have that same level of freedom that they had when I was a young person. And we failed in that. And that's why we're having this hearing today. You know, I was interested, Mr. Chipman, your long experience in the whole law enforcement weapons area. Have assault weapons become more lethal since the expiration of the '94 ban?
Certainly, I've seen a big leap in assault pistols. As I said in my opening testimony, on the streets during the 80s and 90s, we were facing Tech 9s that carried handgun rounds. And now, a blatant attempt to work around the intentions of the National Firearms Act and the regulation of short-barreled rifles, you can get AK and AR pistols, which weren't used in war. They were developed to kill people here domestically. I don't think I know any common gun owners who look to that as a great self-defense weapon, but they fire rounds that leave devastating wounds, and we saw that in Dayton, and they're outside the norm and they're more lethal.
Now, I'm wondering, I mean, when I think about California and the actions taken by the state legislature and governor to make the state safer, do you think state laws are sufficient, given that, as in Gilroy, the shooter can just cross a state line and get something banned in his own state?
We need a national comprehensive approach. I was just out in Denver, and we're talking to people there focused on the issue of gun violence. Half of their crime guns come from other states. Many of the crime guns in Chicago that we heard talked about earlier are coming from states like Indiana, and that's from firearms trafficking. If we had comprehensive and universal laws and approaches to regulation at the national level, there would not be this interstate travel to go and work around the law. It's really no different than when we had different drinking age. Kids would go to another state to get by underage. So I think that's why it's important for us here to be, as federal authorities, making decisions for the country as a whole.
Well, I thank you for that, but there is a difference because a 19-year-old going to drink in New York is a lot different than a 19-year-old going to Nevada and killing children in Gilroy.
Absolutely.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Shabbat is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't yet a member of this body when the 94 gun ban was passed. I was elected that year and sworn in the following year. But as a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, I would not have voted for that at the time. And I would note that when the so-called assault weapons ban was in place, it was 94 to 2004. I would note that that is when the Columbine shooting took place, right in the middle of that. I think it was 99, if I'm not mistaken. And I think contrary to the majority's belief, there's really no conclusive evidence that the weapons ban had any appreciable effect on mass shootings or violent crime. Ms. Swear, would you want to comment on that? Is that your understanding as well?
Thank you, Congressman. That is my understanding, and that was the understanding of those who released the official report on the after the ban expired. What they actually found was that should it be renewed, it would be unlikely to have any meaningful or measurable effect, in part because, as I noted previously, these types of firearms are rarely used to commit crimes in the first place. It's actually handguns and non-assault weapons that are historically and still to this day most often used to commit crimes.
Thank you. Ms. Mueller, you served as a law enforcement officer in, I believe, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your service. And when you were a law enforcement officer, that was during the assault weapons ban when that was in place. Is that correct?
Before, during, and after.
Okay. And given your experience, would you agree with Ms. Swear relative to whether there is any evidence that we were any safer as a society, as a community, when that was in place, or what are your thoughts about that?
Yes, I would agree with her. Personally, professionally, I had it had zero impact on me. I saw no difference before, during, or after the beginning or the end of the assault weapons ban from 94 to 04.
Thank you. Ms. Mueller, could you describe some of the misconceptions that you frequently hear when it comes to the discussion surrounding so-called assault weapons?
One of the things that when we talk about weapon of war, I hear it being a weapon of war. First of all, anything can be used as a weapon when you're in battle, I suppose. But the AR-15 specifically, I have friends that have served in combat roles, and they have told me that that is not a desirable round. They do not like the AR-15, the 223, or the 5.56. This is their personal opinion, but they would much prefer to carry a 308 or something with greater stopping power.
Okay, thank you. And the guns that we're discussing here this morning, do people use these to hunt? Do they use them for self-defense? Are they suitable for both? Could you comment on that?
Yes, sir. We certainly use them in my family. We use them for both. And I will have to be the law-abiding citizen that does have a pistol AR, and I choose that because it is more compact and it does give me the greater capacity, and the more, it's just a better defensive firearm, and it fits better in my car and my vehicle that I'm traveling in. So it's a little bit easier to move around, but I get the same advantages of the AR.
Thank you very much. Ms. Swear, let me go back to you if I could. What do you believe are the major motivations behind the mass shootings that we've seen? And is it your opinion that we ought to be focused on what's actually causing these things as opposed to what we're focused on here today?
Congressman, that is absolutely my opinion. And it is very clear when you look at mass public shooters, what you see is much higher rates of untreated serious mental illness. So people who either, like 1/4 of mass public shooters have been diagnosed with a serious mental illness, or as 2/3 of them have, what you're actually seeing is people who are not in a mentally stable place, even if they haven't been officially diagnosed with any sort of mental illness. But these are, by and large, individuals who are not in a good mental place, who are showing clear signs of being a danger to themselves or others, where there's room for intervention with them. And so that is one of the avenues we have to look at, is how do we actually treat those underlying problems and intervene in an effective, narrow way specifically for those dangerous individuals.
Thank you very much. My time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman goes back. Mr. Cohen is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me ask Mr. Chipman, as a former IACP person myself, as a legal advisor a long time ago, these weapons are made by lots of companies. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
So is Colt the exclusive manufacturer of AR-15s?
No, they are not. We have a variety of ways that you can acquire an AR-15 model. There are imported ones.
But Colt has decided not to produce anymore, manufacture anymore. Is that right?
They describe the market as flooded, and it's my belief that it's flooded by foreign made ARs and the ability to make one your own now.
Are some of those, would any of those be coming from Russia?
The Russian model that I'm familiar with would be more an AK variant.
AK-47?
Yep.
Are they sold here?
They're not only sold here, they're now manufactured in this country, if you're talking about Kalashnikov.
How long have they been manufactured here?
I'm not certain.
Okay. A few years ago, I was in Russia, maybe 3 years ago, and there was an effort then by the Russian government to try to change our policies and get more Kalashnikovs sold in this country. Do you know what they would have been trying to do? This was before the election of President Trump. I was there with during Obama's term.
Sure. I'm aware that companies like Kalashnikov found it advantageous to build the guns here in America to not have to deal with some of the import issues.
And was there a restriction on them manufacturing here?
I'm not aware.
Okay. Do you know anything that's happened during the Trump administration that might have benefited Kalashnikov?
I am not.
Okay. Well, do you know the official position of the IACP on assault weapons?
Yeah, for many years they have opposed and supported a ban on assault weapons.
And why is that?
I think first, as a law enforcement organization, they saw a threat to law enforcement, and also we're responding to these scenes. We are, I think, 200 off-duty officers were in Las Vegas being shot at. I know there were ATF agents. We have families too, and so I think it comes from a place that police are members of our communities, and they want to do a good job and keep streets safe. And these are particularly lethal and threatening when in the wrong hands.
But Mr. Chipman, how can you say that with a straight face when you realize that one good man with a gun could take out that person?
Yeah, I was trained to be that person, and I think that's a big myth. I think the first thing I learned when I was trained with Secret Service is, well, you don't have enough time to pull your gun. You need to get in the way of the bullet and get shot. So I think that's what we see. Is the reality is that anytime you're responding to a shooting, a lot has happened very badly, and we can't have national policy relying on winning gunfights. We need to focus on preventing them.
I appreciate you recognizing my sarcasm. Chief Brackney, do you also agree in your group that assault weapons should not be sold in this country?
Absolutely. And what's actually is disingenuous is that we're arguing about terminology. When you're looking down the face of a high-powered, high-velocity weapon, do you really want to ask, is it an AR, an AK, and can you pull it one trigger at a time, or is it a semi-automatic, or is it something more? I also say the same thing is when we're talking about even arguing pushing back against a only person that should stop a bad person with a gun is a good person with a gun. Actually, what stops a bad person with a gun is keeping a gun out of their hands to start with. And ask that from any law enforcement officer who's ever had to look down the face of a barrel.
Go tell that to their families, their widows, their widowers, their children. Tell that to the community and the persons from all of these mass shootings that we're going to argue about definitions versus the impact that it's having on our communities.
I know this is hearings about assault weapons, which is extremely important, but there's also armor-piercing bullets. Do you also agree that armor-piercing bullets have no place in our society?
Absolutely. They were actually dubbed cop killers is originally how they were put out on the streets. And that's because they could pierce through our bulletproof, our protective gear, our personal protective equipment. So absolutely. And the organizations that I represent and am a part of, PERF, IACP, Noble, and all of the other ones, we stand firmly behind that there are no place in society for the type of weapons that can do the type of damage to not only law enforcement, but to the community at large.
Mr. Chipman, you agree with that? That's the ICP position?
Yeah, absolutely. And there ammo to defeat armor, like military armor, and then there are rifle rounds that defeat ballistic vests we wear that are typically rated to defend against handgun rounds.
I thank each of you for your testimony and your service, and I stand with the police and the sheriff's department and not with the NRA.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Sensenbrenner is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I would disagree with what has been said here because one of the problems we had last time, and I was here when this was passed, was making proper definitions. So if we want to achieve this goal, we have to have those definitions done correctly. Now, I've heard a lot of the arguments on this, and a lot of it revolves around what the firearm looks like rather than how the firearm works. And it seems to me that the problem is how the firearm works. Now, fully automatic military-style rifles have been illegal for somebody to buy since the 30s, except with a very, very hard-to-get permit from the ATF. Rifles that are semi-automatic are legal for hunting in most, if not all, states. I haven't gotten this up to date yet, but there are a lot of semi-automatic hunting rifles that state DNRs or fish and game regulators feel are sporting rifles. I don't think we have any business here taking away hunting rifles from people who are not disqualified from owning them and people who think that hunting is a good sport. I am not a hunter, so I don't go out and sit in the cold during the deer hunting season. But, let's, define this correctly. Now, I would like to, ask, some of the people who support banning, quote, assault rifles to tell me, and, do you think that hunting rifles ought to be banned if they are semi-automatic? Let's start with you, Mayor Whaley.
Thank you, Representative. My point here today is just to reiterate that constitutional rights require responsibility and balance. And the people of Dayton also have the right to be safe.
Can you give me a yes or no answer on whether hunting rifles ought to be banned if we don't define this correctly?
I think that this body will define this correctly, and
What's
I think that will have.
Not that you're asking what our opinion is. Dr. Tovar, we got no answer from Mayor Whaley on whether hunting rifles ought to be banned. So let the record state that, Dr. Tovar.
So the question is, should hunting rifles be banned?
Yes.
Is that the question?
Yes.
I agree that
no?
there should be a definition of what a so-called assault rifle is. A so-called weapon.
Let's answer the question. If you have this definition, of a semi-automatic firearm that looks bad because it's got a shoulder thing and something that people can point. I don't own any firearms, so I'm not defining this correctly. But I was not elected to sit here, and tell people who like to hunt that all of a sudden the firearm that they have been using legally according to state DNR regulations, ends up being banned because we in Congress think it should be. Now, should we write a definition that is so broad that hunting rifles will be banned? Yes or no?
I think a definition should be made as terms of what should be legal and what should
Okay,
not.
well, you're not answering the question. Chief Brackney. Yes or no?
Thank you for the question. I believe any weapon that can be used to hunt individuals should be banned.
Well, that's not what the Virginia DNR says. Ms. Rand.
We think that you can clearly distinguish assault rifles from sporting hunting rifles. And just because you can hunt with an AR-15 does not make it a hunting rifle. Having said that, we do not support a ban on true hunting rifles.
Okay, well, I will put that down as a question mark. Ms. Swearer.
If the question is whether hunting rifles should be banned just because they are semi-automatic, the answer is no. And I would point out that, again, when we're talking about functional difference between hunting rifles and assault weapons, we're not talking about lethality, we're not talking about caliber, we're talking about things like pistol grips and barrel shrouds that don't change the functional mechanics. And so I would say, no, we shouldn't be banning hunting rifles just because they have pistol grip and they're easier to use.
Ms. Mueller, then my time will be up.
No.
I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I'd like to briefly address the members of the audience in the hearing room. We welcome your respect and your right to be here. We also in turn ask for your respect as we proceed with the business of the committee, and it's the intention of the committee to proceed with this hearing without disruptions, and we ask everyone to respect that. Mr. Cicilline, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding the first hearing on assault weapons in 20 years. There's a reason why assault weapons have become the weapon of choice for mass killers. They're weapons of war designed to kill as many people as possible in as short a time as possible. On August 4th, a shooter used a lawfully purchased AR-15 style assault rifle to take the lives of 9 people and injure 27 more people in less than a minute in Dayton, Ohio. Just one day earlier, a gunman legally purchased an AK-47 style rifle and within minutes killed 22 people and injured 27 in a Walmart in El Paso. And on July 28th, 2019, a gunman legally purchased an assault weapon weeks before killing 3 people and wounding 12 people at the Gilroy Garlic Festival in California, with police on the scene in under a minute. In each of these shootings, despite the quick response times and heroic efforts of law enforcement and first responders, 34 people were killed within a week's time and 60 more people injured. And this does not even begin to account for the mental health consequences that these shootings have on survivors and the impacted communities. I want to welcome all the wonderful advocates who are here, the family members who have lost loved ones to gun violence, and thank you for being here and for being such a powerful voice in this debate. I particularly want to acknowledge Mayor Whaley and thank her for her graceful and strong leadership in a very difficult time. I reintroduced H.R. 1296, the assault weapons ban of 2019, to address the harm that mass shootings have on our communities and to keep the American people safe from senseless acts of violence. This bipartisan legislation with 211 co-sponsors prohibits the sale, transfer, manufacture, and importation of semi-automatic weapons and ammunition feeding devices capable of accepting more than 10 rounds while protecting hunting and sporting rifles and assault weapons used by members of the military and law enforcement. There are 215 weapons that are exempted in the bill that are sporting rifles and hunting rifles. So this notion that we're going to ban hunters is false. Had the legislation been passed and signed into law, it would have prevented the tragedies we witnessed in Dayton, El Paso, and Gilroy. If you listen to my Republican colleagues on this committee, you would think the assault weapons ban is some radical idea that's never been done before. The truth is it was the law for 10 years, from 1994 to 2004. It passed the House with 38 Republican votes. It worked. And no law-abiding American lost their guns. In mass shootings, 63% more people were killed when shooters used assault weapons or high-capacity weapons rather than other types of firearms. And during the 10-year period of the 1994 assault weapons ban, mass shooting fatalities were 70% less likely than when the ban was in place. With a ban, it's less likely that Americans will be killed while at their favorite band concert, while hanging out at a bar with friends, while praying at their places of worship, while simply going to school. But instead of attacking the problem of mass shootings head on, we're building schools with curved hallways to minimize casualties from an active shooter. And we're sending our kids off to school with bulletproof backpacks. This is sickening. We have an opportunity to do something. We have a solution, one that worked and made a real difference. And I'm going to ask you, Ms. Rand, if you look at this 2016 study by Professor Louis Cleverus of the University of Massachusetts at Boston, he analyzed data on every gun massacre where 6 or more people were shot and killed for 50 years to analyze whether the 10-year-old federal ban on assault weapons had any effect on gun massacres. As you can see, when the ban lapsed in 2004, the numbers of gun massacres shot up with a 183% increase in massacres, 34 massacre incidents, and a 239% increase in massacre deaths. So does that establish, in fact, the effectiveness of the assault weapons ban?
Well, I think that the 94 ban definitely had a chilling effect on the industry. It was able to evade the law in certain ways, and your bill addresses all of those things that the industry does. So your bill would be even more effective. But we know from the statistics that there clearly was a reduction in mass shootings. And since the ban lapsed, the industry has only become more and more and more aggressive. And one point I would like to make about the increasing lethality is the huge increase in the capacity of magazines. We very seldom saw 75-round, 100-round magazines. We see those all the time now.
Thank you, Ms. Rand. And that, of course, the legislation I proposed has the one characteristic tech that you previously spoke about. Chief Brackney, on August 14th of this year, 6 police officers in Philadelphia were shot during an 8-hour standoff with a gunman using an AR-15. According to the Violence Policy Center, in 2016, 1 in 4 police officers killed in the line of duty was killed by an assault weapon. And in attacks on law enforcement that resulted in multiple police fatalities, assault weapons killed 75% of those officers. In your opinion, would an assault weapons ban assist law enforcement with protecting themselves and communities from gun violence?
Absolutely. And what we also want to consider is these open carry states. It's much easier to identify a person who has an illegal weapon if they're not allowed to have one to start. I wouldn't have to make the distinction whether it's a good person with a gun or a bad person with a gun. Absolutely support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have several unanimous consent requests. The first is a letter of support for the assault weapons ban signed by nearly 150 organizations, including the Newtown Action Alliance and the Brady Campaign.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent to have a study by the Violence Policy Center that shows 1 in 4 law enforcement officers slain in the line of duty by an assault weapon.
Without objection.
Ask unanimous consent that this report of a 2018 study published in the Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery, which found that mass fatalities were 70% less likely to occur during the 1994 assault weapon ban period.
Without objection.
An article reflecting a poll by Morning Consult showing 70% of Americans, including the majority of Republicans, support an assault weapons ban.
Without objection.
And finally, a Fox News poll that shows 67% of Americans support an assault weapons ban.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
On behalf of the
Gentlemen.
AR-15, other rights that
I appreciate.
the
Gentleman.
Second Amendment, prescribed by the Supreme Court. We will not comply with any effort by the justice. We will not comply with any efforts to ban or confiscate our legally owned property. You go to jail. We will not give them up. I speak on behalf of millions of owners who will not comply with radical leftist plans to confiscate or ban our legally owned property. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Another reminder for the audience that while we appreciate your being here, if you refrain from making any noise or otherwise disrupting the proceedings, or like the last gentleman, Capitol Police will remove you from the audience so that we can return to order. Mr. Buck, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Whaley, you mentioned in your opening statement that the shooter in Dayton was neutralized by the police. Was the shooter killed by police?
Yes, Representative.
And was he killed with a gun or several guns?
Several guns.
Okay. Mr. Chipman, would you agree with me that most gun violence is caused, most violence is caused by handguns? Most gun violence is caused by handguns?
Most criminal gun violence, handgun is used in that violence.
And would you also agree with me? And first of all, let me thank you for your 25 years of experience with the ATF. I spent 15 years as a federal prosecutor, 10 years as a district attorney, worked many times with ATF and appreciated their hard work. Would you also agree with me that gang and gang members are responsible for upwards of 90% of all violent crimes in this country, and nationwide, 80% of all gun-related homicides in the U.S. Are caused by gang members?
That conflicts with all the information I have.
You ever use a gang database while you were with the ATF?
Sure.
And did you find gang database reliable?
It depends what I was looking for.
Gang affiliation?
Yeah, the gang affiliation is a very loose term that law enforcement can label people. Again, my hesitancy is that there was nothing in my 25-year experience at ATF that suggests that 90% of gun crime is tied to gangs. Nothing at all.
I asked you about gang affiliation, but let me ask you about the NICS database. Are you familiar with the NICS database?
Yes, I am.
And have you ever run across a false positive in a NICS database, meaning someone who has been identified as a prohibited person because of a prior felony or other reason, and yet the database indicated that this particular person who attempted to purchase a gun was prohibited and they were not prohibited?
Yes, very rarely.
Okay, but it happens.
It has happened.
Okay. And Ms. Swear, could we put a picture up, please? Ms. Swear, my question to you is approximately how many AR-15s are owned in America?
So there's no precise estimate, but if we're talking about the AR-15 semi-automatic general rifle platform of that nature, estimates are at least several million into upwards of 16 to 18 million.
Upwards of 16 to 18 million, and approximately how many have been used in mass shootings in the last decade, for example?
Probably several dozen.
Several dozen, okay.
Yes, sir.
And so the several dozen minus the 16 to 18 million, my Democrat friends are suggesting that those law-abiding citizens have those weapons taken away from them. Is that correct?
That is my understanding, yes, sir.
Okay. And you see the AR-15 that I am holding with a former member of the Judiciary Committee, Trey Gowdy from South Carolina?
Yes, sir, I do.
And can you tell by looking at that gun if that gun has ever killed anybody?
No, I cannot.
And why is that?
Because frankly, I don't know who's holding it. I don't know its history, but if I had to guess based on statistics alone, there is a very, very high chance it has never been used to kill an innocent human being.
Along with the 16 to 18 million guns that are in circulation in America right now.
That is correct. The vast majority of them will never be used in criminal actions.
And are those individuals, and let me just tell you from my experience in my district in eastern Colorado, an AR-15 is used to kill raccoons that are, or foxes or other animals that are predators and trying to disturb individuals for trying to, kill chickens or are disturbing agriculture in some way. Is that your understanding also of how some, I'm not saying a majority of that 16 to 18 million, but some of those guns are used?
Yes, it's actually not suitable for a lot of more higher end hunting for larger game, because it's actually more suitable for, as you inferred, more varmint hunting, small predator hunting.
Okay. And what would the effect, Ms. Mueller, of this particular law that we are discussing now have on law-abiding citizens in terms of either using weapons to protect domestic animals or farm animals or for self-defense? What would the effect be for those 16 to 18 million that we've just identified with Ms. Swearer?
It would criminalize us having the firearm that we choose to use. As Ms. Swearer said, that her mother was able to use accurately. And I don't understand some of the conversation that we're having about making it more difficult for the 100 million people that may have these weapons, make it more difficult for them to control or use properly.
I thank you. You back.
Has expired. Mr. Richmond, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I don't necessarily profess to be an expert in hunting varmint, but my general sense is that if you're hitting them with an AK-15, you're not hunting them, you're killing them. And that's the only purpose of doing it. But let me just get two things straight with Mrs. Swear and Mrs. Muller. Both of you all mentioned that the purpose you see, especially with your mother and her choosing her firearm, was accuracy and stopping power. So when you describe characteristics for self-defense, you would characterize stopping power and accuracy as primary objectives.
Yes, sir. Yes, if I have a threat, I want it to stop.
Okay. Now, let me go to Chief Brackney real quick with Noble. Let's take the gun, the FN-57, for example, which has 0 knockdown power, but its bullets will go through your shield, if you have an armor shield, and your vest. If it has 0 stopping power, what self-defense purpose does that gun, the FN-57, have?
It would not. When you think about stopping power and the risk of being on the other end or the receiving end of those high velocity, high capacity rounds and things that can go through them, you want to think about accuracy. I do appreciate the story about a mom having the ability to be very accurate and to have a very tight capacity in putting rounds into place. So think of the damage that if my mom, who's 78, God bless her, if she decided she wanted to be extremely accurate, what about the person who's very well-intentioned? How accurate could they be? How quickly could they be? And the damage that they could do, very well-intentioned.
Let me also ask, because I know that our law enforcement every day stop people who are citizens of the United States, but who also answer to another calling and cause called sovereign citizen. And if we just take my district, since I've been in Congress, I've lost 5 officers who were overpowered by perpetrators because they were better armed than my police officers, one of which was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, both with an, we can argue over assault rifle, how we determine it, but let's just for purpose of this hearing call them weapons of mass destruction, because there are 3 officers in Baton Rouge whose families will never see them again, and 2 in St. John Parish who will never see them again, because in St. John Parish, it was a traffic stop that initiated, and sovereign citizen does not recognize law enforcement's ability to stop them. So they exited the car with the trailer with a assault weapon, ambushed the officers, and they never had a chance. If we go to Baton Rouge, the officers responded to the call, knew the perpetrator was dangerous, but they had handguns. He had a long gun wearing body armor, and they never stood a chance. So in the sense of patrolling, and I guess I'm trying to make a balance in between that need for a weapon of mass destruction and the need for self-defense, because I think of my family. But when I thought about my family not being necessarily the best in marksmanship, I thought about having a shotgun, which has a wide spray. And then there's a gun called the Judge, which is could fire 357 bullet. It's a revolver, or it could fire a shotgun shell, which is great for self-defense. But the question becomes, why such large capacity magazines on these assault weapons and assault rifles if we're talking about hunting? When you hunt, you miss, you load up again, you try again. But if your goal is mass carnage, then you just keep pulling your trigger, or you install a bump stock and you can create multiple carnage. So from a law enforcement standpoint, I'm trying to figure out for the home self-defense, are we really talking about self-defense when we're talking about these weapons of mass destruction? And for God forbid, if you lived in a apartment complex or a community with attached homes, how the bullets will go through the walls and travel apartment after apartment after apartment if you have the wrong one. So in your law enforcement estimate, does the self-defense argument hold water when you're talking about weapons that shoot such high velocity projectiles and has such large capacity magazines?
Thank you for that. In 2009 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, April 4th, a domestic case, an individual had a weapon for protection in their home. 3 officers responded to that domestic because a dog urinated on the floor. When they arrived, immediately opened fire, ambushed. I lived 3 homes down from that killing. The perpetrator shot the officers immediately in the face as soon as they opened the door. They went through their vest. He then proceeded with his high-powered weapon to shoot the second officer who he thought he was playing possum. He then shot him in his face, leaving that officer a widow and 2 small children. An off-duty officer was responding from around the corner. He then got out of this car. He unloaded approximately 30 rounds into that officer who lay dying on the street. As we exchanged over 600 rounds, we were outgunned, firepowered at that time. That weapon was supposed to be for his protection of his home. It was definitely used as an assault weapon to murder 3 officers in the city of Pittsburgh. And that city has been traumatized. And it's been 10 years exactly to this date. Thank you.
Thank you. The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mayor, I was curious, you had indicated in your testimony that you were here basically to ask us to do something. What bill would you like to be passed to effectively, in your words, do something?
Well, there's a number of bills that are before you.
What would be your favorite?
Well, I would first, for this body, I think that the assault weapons ban bill that Representative Cicilline has put forward is very thoughtful and should move forward. That bill would affect the Dayton shooting, frankly, and so it would make a great difference. So there won't be cities like Dayton that have experienced this kind of trauma.
I appreciate that. It's just we hear people, especially in this committee, at times say, even if it's wrong, we need to do something, and that's not the way you maintain a constitutional republic, and you maintain any freedom if it's not very thoughtful. But Doctor, you were mentioning the wounds, the horrific wounds you were dealing with, and you mentioned that normally you're dealing with pencil hole entries that are sometimes hard to find. Well, those pencil hole entries are normally made by the .223 caliber, just barely a hair bigger than a .22. Isn't that right? You were looking at more like a .308 because it was more similar to an AK-47 wound, correct?
I don't know the types of weapons.
Nomenclature, yeah.
To be honest.
From my understanding, it was basically a manufactured AK-47 that is much, much bigger than the AR-15, which is a .223 round, just barely bigger than a .22, whereas the AK, the nomenclature in the Army, they taught us 7.62, but basically like a .308, and those can do devastating damage. And my understanding is that somebody privately made that and sold that. Is it?
Apart from shotgun wounds, which are also devastating because of the large impact, I haven't seen anything like this in my history as a trauma surgeon, and since then as well. That's what I can testify.
I appreciate the help that you provided. I swear you talked about the use of guns between 500,000 to 2 million times a year. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
It's rather amazing that many times people would need to use guns to defend themselves. Rather shocking. But I certainly appreciate your comments about your mom. It is easier to fire one of those. I have to disagree with you when you say it has the maximum stopping power. After Vietnam, we were taught that in the Army that we went to the M16, now the M4, same nomenclature, but same 223 size round, that it was faster and might be more likely to wound, but not, it doesn't have the stopping power of a 308.
To be clear, Congressman, I would not disagree with you. My intent was to show that it has more stopping power than, say, a handgun, so she can use it more accurately and more effectively than.
But I'd have to disagree with you there. A 9mm, a 45, a 38, they have a lot more stopping power than an AR-15 223 round, correct?
I would disagree with you in some cases with regard to that.
You don't think a bullet hole from a 9mm would do more damage than a 223 round?
I would say I would much rather have a 9mm than no firearm, but generally speaking, it's a combination of both stopping
But
power
don't you
and.
acknowledge that your mother was more comfortable with the 223 because it doesn't have the kick, it's not as intimidating, you can refire it more easily, correct?
Yes, but part of that is also just the inherent setup of a rifle. It's a more stable base.
We've seen the gun stats go back and forth, or crime rather, go back and forth over the years. And it seemed to me that it was related to putting criminals in jail, being tough on crime, and the pendulum swings back. But now it looks like the pendulum is swinging against law-abiding citizens for the first time. And that really is a concern. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 25 years ago, we passed a law that prevented the manufacture or sale of assault weapons for ordinary Americans, and it made a difference. Mass shooting fatalities dropped 70% between 1994 and 2004. But 15 years later, Congress failed the American people by allowing the assault weapons ban to sunset. That was in 2004. And since then, we've had repeatedly failures. We've had repeated failures to make even modest reforms to unfettered gun access in the United States. Because of our 15 years of inaction, we are now living a tragedy of repeated horrific events interspersed with lulls where American ideals of freedom and safety and justice crumble before our very eyes. And for what? Because folks are afraid of the NRA? There's a time for moderation, for cautious, restrained debate, but that ended when Sandy Hook happened, when Parkland, Pulse nightclub, El Paso, then Dayton happened. Now is a time for justice to reassert itself as a guiding American principle, and it's time for Congress to do the right thing. According to recent polls, 7 out of 10 people are in favor of a ban on the manufacture and sale of assault weapons. There's broad consensus on this issue because it makes sense. We've done it before and we can do it again, and I look forward to hearing from our panel of esteemed witnesses on this important topic. Now, the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act was passed in 2005, the year after Congress allowed the assault weapons ban to expire. And the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act prohibits people from filing wrongful death lawsuits against gun manufacturers and gun dealers. When the families of the Sandy Hook victims took Remington Outdoor Company to court for mass marketing assault weapons to civilians, specifically for mass shootings, it took the case 5 years just to overcome a challenge under the PLCAA. And that was one of the success stories. What we don't see are all of the assault weapons cases that are not brought into civil court because of PLCAA. Now, Mr. Chipman, how does the existence of the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act prevent victims and their families from seeking justice?
It blocks them from holding an industry accountable before a court of law like every other business in America is held accountable.
Civil suits often act as a regulator to prevent negligent acts by companies that otherwise have no regulatory incentive to act in the best interest of consumers. And not just negligent acts, but intentional acts and fraudulent acts to cover it up. Do you believe that assault weapons companies are taking steps to avoid negligence when they manufacture these devices and sell them to civilians?
I think certainly their marketing these days is suspect. I think that even the markings on AR receivers that the company that sold in Dayton, that you can get sayings on them, like "not made in my S-hole country," are things that are marketing to a certain type of extreme and violent part of this country. We've seemed to balance this with cigarettes, allow people lawfully smoke, but protect our nation from marketing that would put people at harm. And so also the other thing that has been effective in keeping data out is just the restrictions placed on me at ATF, that data that wouldn't hurt my criminal investigations, but might be useful to this panel to decide what crime guns are the most popular amongst criminals. How did they get in criminals' hands? You don't have access to that data. It's blocked. So I think there's a whole host of things that make it very difficult to hold this industry accountable like we hold accountable other industries.
Thank you. If PLACA were overturned or rescinded, what difference do you think it could make in how companies sell and manufacture assault weapons?
We'd have to see how things played out in court, and I have faith in our judicial system that if victims had an opportunity to be heard in court, courts would do the right thing to protect our nation.
Thank you. My time has expired and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Fewer than 1 in 50 of all prisoners that were incarcerated for a violent crime obtained a firearm from a local retail source and possessed, carried, or used it during the offense for which they were in prison. Among the 287,400 prisoners who had possessed a firearm during their offense, more than half either stole it, found it at the scene of the crime, obtained it off the street, or from the underground market. That's the reality of where people get guns who use them to commit crimes. About 1.3% of prisoners obtained a gun from a retail source. 1.3%. That's the reality of where people get guns, regardless of what kind of gun they have. Studies have indicated very clearly that higher rates of gun ownership are not associated with higher rates of violent crime. Switzerland and Israel have much higher gun ownership rates than the United States, but experience far fewer homicides and have much lower violent crime rates than many European nations with strict gun control laws. Canada is ranked 12th in the world for the number of civilian-owned guns per capita and reports one of the world's lowest homicide rates. But even then, some provinces have a higher homicide rate than United States with less restrictive laws and higher rates of gun ownership. The Brady campaign against gun violence ironically makes clear this point. Gun freedom states that score poorly, like New Hampshire, Vermont, Idaho, and Oregon, have some of the lowest homicide rates. Conversely, gun control states that received high scores, like Maryland and Illinois, experienced some of the nation's highest homicide rates. Legally owned firearms are used for lawful purposes much more often than they are used to commit crimes or suicide. In 2013, President Barack Obama ordered the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to assess existing research on gun violence, and this is what they found. According to the CDC, self-defense can be an important crime deterrent. Semi-automatic rifles, such as the AR-15, are commonly used in self-defense, especially in homes of law-abiding citizens, because they're easier to control than handguns, more versatile than handguns, and offer the advantage of up to 30 rounds of protection. Here are some examples of when an AR-15 has been used to save lives. On Oswego, Illinois, 2018, a man with an AR-15 intervened to stop a neighbor's knife attack and cited the larger weapon's intimidation factor as a reason why the attacker dropped the knife and ended the attack, saving the purported victim. Catawba County, North Carolina, 2018, a 17-year-old successfully fought off 3 armed attackers with his AR-15, saving his own life. Houston, Texas, 2017. A homeowner survived a drive-by shooting by defending himself with his AR-15. Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, 2017. A homeowner's son killed 3 would-be burglars with an AR-15 in what was found to be justifiable self-defense. Texas, 2013. A 15-year-old boy used an AR-15 during a home invasion to save both his life and that of his 12-year-old sister from a violent armed intruder. Rochester, New York. Home intruders fled after facing an AR-15. Ms. Mueller, you served as a law enforcement officer during the time that the previous assault weapon ban was in place from 94 to 2004. Did you see any impact anecdotally on your safety as a law enforcement officer or on those you were sworn to protect and serve?
Dang it, got me. I have previously testified that I did not see any before, during, or after, and I'm listening to these numbers, and I would like to follow up on the 70% less likely to occur during assault weapons ban. I don't understand that, and I don't understand why we would have allowed it to sunset if it were an effective policy.
Yeah, well, it was contested, and as I reported, the CDC did its own study and didn't come up with the same conclusions. So, is there anything else that you heard today you'd like to respond to?
Oh, there's a lot.
Well, press on then.
I have 26 seconds.
Yep.
Okay. I would like to, Congressman Richmond's already gone, but the 5.7, the FN 5.7, a little bit of education there. It shoots flatter. As a woman, it's less recoil. I love this little gun. It's not a 57, it's a 5.7, and it shoots flatter so I can be more accurate at longer distances. And with the minimal recoil, and it holds 30 rounds. For a pistol, that's good. It's got kind of a weird grip, but that allows me to protect myself better. This is probably, and it does have knockdown power, yes. But my goal here is to educate people. We are law-abiding, responsible gun owners, and please don't legislate the 150 million people just like me into being criminals. Like, because it has happened. You've already done it. The legislation on bump stocks. I was a bump stock owner, and I had to make a decision. Do I become a felon or do I comply? And like that gentleman that just got escorted out, I will not comply with the assault weapons ban.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Chairman Adler, for calling this important hearing today. Thanks to all the witnesses for your testimony. Welcome to all the advocates. I'd especially like to welcome my constituents, Fred Guttenberg, father of Jamie and Robert Chentrup, brother of Carmen. I ask unanimous consent to include statements from Jen Guttenberg and Ryan Servitis into the record. Seeing no objection, I'll move on. Jen is the mother of Jamie Guttenberg. Jamie was a vibrant, beautiful 14-year-old freshman at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas when she was killed with an assault rifle in her school on February 14th, 2018. Jen said that on that day she lost her best friend and now must live with the image of her child running down the hallway, running away from an AR-15. Ryan was a freshman and survivor of the MSD shooting. He and others went on to found the March for Our Lives movement. Some of those students are here today, and I want to welcome and recognize them. In his testimony, Ryan said, "I'm not just asking for change, I'm begging for it. Not because I don't want to live in a country where every other day I read about another community destroyed, another group of innocent lives ripped away from us. As Americans, we owe it to ourselves to do better, and we can." I have all kinds of questions that I wanted to ask, but here's my response to what I've heard today. We've heard over and over about the people who need to have these guns because they're easy to hunt critters, because they can be used for self-defense. These guns can also be used to hunt people. And I've been carrying around this piece of paper since February 15th, 2018. I'm going to read what's on it. Alyssa Alladef, 14, Scott Beagle, 35,
Martin Duque, 14, Nick Dworet, 17, Aaron Feist, 37, Jamie Guttenberg, 14, Chris Hickson, 49, Luke Hoyer, 15, Gina Montalto, 14, Carol Loughran, 14, Joaquin Oliver, 17, Elena Petty, 14, Meadow Pollock, 18, Helena Ramsey, 17, Alex Schechter, 14, Carmen Shentrup, 16, Peter Wang, 15. Every one of those 17 who were killed at Stoneman Douglas will never be older than that age on the day they were killed. I understand the importance of the Second Amendment, but how it is that we can have a hearing where one of the witnesses compares these weapons to shoes is just beyond me. We're gonna give a list. I've got another list. How about this list? Dayton, 9 killed, 17 injured. Las Vegas, 58 killed, 422 injured. Orlando, 49 killed, 53 injured. Sandy Hook, 27 killed, including 26 and 7-year-old babies and 2 injured. Sutherland Springs, 26 killed, 20 injured. El Paso, 22 killed, 24 injured. Pittsburgh, Tree of Life, 11 killed, 6 injured. And at Stoneman Douglas, there were also 17 who were injured. I understand that this is not easy for everyone, but I want everyone to understand how for the lives who have been ripped from the face of this earth, for their families, it will never be the same. And when we're looking, what we're trying to do here, the reason this hearing is so important is because we know that there are things that we can do to keep us safe. We heard some of them, even apart from an assault weapons ban. We heard some of them today. Ms. Swear, when you talked about how we can identify people who pose a threat, you're right, we can. That's why we need to pass a red flags law so that we can keep dangerous guns out of their hands. You're right about that. The universal background checks bill that's sitting in the Senate, near universal approval. Let's pass it in the Senate. But what we're here today to talk about is something that can prevent these kinds of attacks. Mr. Chipman, you talked about the National Firearms Act regulations as a way to get assault weapons out of dangerous hands. You walked us through the process that it takes for someone to buy a weapon regulated under that system, registration with ATF, background check, photos, fingerprints, and a transfer tax. You told us that it was passed after National Firearms Act of 1934 was passed after a Valentine's Day massacre in 1929. We had a Valentine's Day massacre in 2018 in my community. Have there been efforts? Are there people clamoring for us to repeal the National Firearms Act, Mr. Chipman? No, in fact, the industry is working very hard to work around it. It's a law that's been in effect. That have we seen machine guns and sawed-off shotguns used repeatedly the way we've seen assault weapons used in these mass shootings? No, it's a law that works. And it's a law that we should amend to treat assault weapons the same way we treat machine guns and sawed-off shotguns. That will help keep our communities safe. Mr. Chairman, I am immensely grateful that you're holding this hearing today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
There should be no, the rules of the House provide there should be no demonstrations of approval or disapproval from the audience. Without objection, the documents referenced by the gentleman from Florida will be entered into the record. I now recognize the gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Swearer, did I pronounce that right?
Yes, sir.
All right. Ms. Swearer, define the type of guns the Democrats want to ban.
It appears to me common semi-automatic firearms that just happen to have certain features like pistol grips and barrel shrouds, even though they are functionally the equivalent of other commonly owned semi-automatic firearms.
Semi-automatic weapons with a magazine capacity of 10 rounds or more with scary features. Is that right?
Yes, sir. That is my understanding.
How many types of guns does that entail? Is that a lot?
A lot. Yes, sir.
All kinds of them?
Yes, sir.
I think when your opening remarks, you talked about the scary features, but they're just features. They don't, other than the look, they don't change the way the weapon the impact the weapon may have on a bad guy trying to do someone harm, right?
No, sir, they don't change the function. In fact, some of them, like barrel shrouds, actually protect lawful users from things like serious burns.
And as I read the Second Amendment, it doesn't say the right to bear arms shall not be infringed unless the gun has scary features. It doesn't say that, does it?
No, sir, it does not.
You think bad guys are going to follow this law?
Sir, they already fail to follow many of our laws.
Yeah, only good guys, only law-abiding people like yourself. Others are going to follow this law, right?
Yes.
Do you think law-abiding people will be less safe to protect themselves, their family, their property, if this law that the Democrats are proposing actually happens, or this bill that the Democrats are proposing actually becomes law?
I think worse than that, sir, you will see millions of otherwise law-abiding citizens become felons overnight for nothing more than having scary-looking features on firearms.
Yeah, do you think if a criminal suspects that a person they're thinking about targeting for a crime, if they suspect that individual may have a firearm, do you think there's less chance they target them for a crime?
We actually know this to be the case. So when you look at studies that have come out of the 90s between what are considered hot burglary rates, so burglary rates where individuals are home during the home invasion, that they are actually lower in the United States than in the United Kingdom. And when they follow up with those criminals, part of the reason for that is that in the United States, there is a fear amongst people who would commit burglaries and home invasions that there might be someone home who
It's common
who can do something.
sense. Bad guy's walking down the street. He's trying to figure out which home he's going to rob. In one driveway, there's a pickup truck with the gun rack that says, "Make America Great Again" on the bumper sticker, right? And in the next driveway, there's a Volkswagen with a bumper sticker that says, "O'Rourke for president." Who do you think they're going to rob?
So I will refrain from making assumptions about who gun owners are, but generally speaking, criminals do tend to take the path of least resistance.
Of course. I always say this, bad guys aren't stupid. They're just bad. They're just evil. They're not going to follow the law. And what this legislation will do is make it more difficult for law-abiding people like you, like all kinds of folks, to protect themselves when some bad guy is bent on doing something wrong.
Generally speaking, yes, and that is something we know happens right now between 500,000 and 2 million times a year, is law-abiding Americans defending themselves with firearms.
Yep. Ms. Mueller, you want to add anything? I got a
Yes,
minute
sir.
30.
Yes, sir. First of all, anybody in here who has endured any kind of unspeakable violence or lost loved ones, I want to say thank you, or I'm sorry, because I want somebody there immediately. I want you to be your own first responder, and I will be glad to talk to you about how to keep your family safe. I am sorry that this has happened to you, and my community is the first one that wants to make sure everybody is safe with a firearm. These gun-free zones, 90%, over 90%, what we're talking about, these mass murders are happening in gun-free zones. Every time you guys legislate against the gun owner, you're counterproductive. And it breaks my heart to hear these stories of these kids and their ages, and that you have to put people back together in a hospital. It's
Ms. Mueller, sorry to interrupt here. Let me ask you one question. This is a ban on sale of this type of weapon as defined under the Democrats' legislation as we move forward. But do you think this is just a first step? Do you take former Congressman O'Rourke at his word when he says we're going to take these type of weapons, we're going to get these weapons? You think this is just step one that they're proposing?
That's what I think the millions of gun owners are fearful in allowing this death by 1,000 cuts. We've already had panelists here that say that every firearm is capable of lethal, and if it can hunt a human, then it shouldn't be in our hands. And Mr. O'Rourke did probably expose a plan that they have been denying for so long, but we feel it, we know it. You can say it and call it whatever you want, but we know it's a slippery slope.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from California.
Thank you, Chairman, and I want to thank the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, for bringing this legislation forward. Dr. Rios Tovar, thank you for your work in the community. And it was hard to hear the story of the first patient that came to you that day, but was it a scary looking feature that caused the death of that patient?
I don't know what that gun looked like. I just know what the bullet wounds look like. And I know that when you have a high capacity magazine, whether it's a semi-automatic rifle that you are reloading multiple times, you have the capability to have devastating injuries to multiple casualties.
And would you agree when you put a pistol grip on a long rifle where the round already has, high velocity, high energy, you can take the least skilled shooter and they can indiscriminately spray a crowd, and a wound like the one that you had to attend to can occur?
I could assume so.
It reminds me of a gunshot victim whose case I prosecuted in Oakland, where the victim was shot in the back of the thigh and he succumbed to the wounds. And his mom asked me, she said, I don't get it. You would think if you're shot in the leg or the arm that, you would survive. That's where you'd want to be hit. And the ballistics expert and the autopsy doctor said, actually, no, because it was a long rifle round and 40 rounds were fired at him and he was hit just once. Just like the victim you attended to, it leaves very little chance of survival. Mr. Chipman, also thank you for your service to our country. And I read your testimony, and it seems to me that you support a ban on the future sales and manufacturing of assault weapons. Is that right?
Yeah, similar to what we did in 1986 with machine guns.
And, I hear you, and I agree with you as far as the, National Firearms Act and making sure that they're registered. But would you agree that we want to ban future sales and manufacturing because it's a dangerous weapon different than a long rifle used for hunting, or a pistol used to shoot for sport, or a shotgun used to protect someone in their house? That this is just a different weapon.
Yes, they're particularly lethal.
And so I guess my concern is, because I want this bill to pass, I will vote for it to pass. But as you described earlier, if this passes, just like the 94 law, we will still leave millions. The NRA estimates 15 million assault rifles in our communities. So if these weapons are dangerous in the future, wouldn't you agree that they're dangerous now, and that there has to be some way to protect people now from ever having their kids shot in the school, their parent shot in a church, their sister shot at a concert from one of these weapons?
We absolutely have to address the most lethal weapons that are already in civilians' hands. And I believe the National Firearms Act is the best way to approach that.
So my proposal, and again, I appreciate what the Giffords Group is doing, but my proposal is this: that if it's dangerous in the future, it's dangerous now. And that it would be very hard for us to pass this legislation, and then, God forbid, there would be a mass shooting, and after there was a celebration on the House steps, that a weapon that was grandfathered in was killed to take dozens of lives, and we would have to explain to victims that we allowed those weapons to stay in use. And I also think it would create confusion among the public. If there's a ban on assault weapons, why was this weapon used? And knowing the NRA and their misinformation operations, that they would say, look, they had the ban, it didn't work. My proposal would be to do what Australia did, which would be to have a buyback period, to allow people like Ms. Mueller and others to use their weapons at a shooting range or a hunting club, to allow them to be possessed there, but nowhere else in our community, and that we would pay at market rate, as they did in Australia, for these weapons. Now, Australia did this, and they were able to get off the streets 700,000. We won't get off as cheaply, but it's not as if this is something that never happened. So I hope we can aspire to do that, but this is a first important step, and I thank all of the witnesses for participating, and I thank all of the families for being here. Because the families have picked themselves up from unimaginable grief, we are at this moment. There are 18 fewer NRA members of Congress today endorsed by the NRA than there were a year ago. So keep marching, keep caring, and we will see action, and we will all be safer. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Swear, the arguments around these bills seem to have an inordinate faith that somehow they're going to keep these weapons out of the hands of criminals and madmen and terrorists. I don't share that faith. I look at how effective our drug laws have been at keeping drugs out of the hands of addicts and wonder if that faith isn't misplaced. As Mr. Biggs pointed out, aren't a majority of the firearms already used in crimes, already being obtained illegally?
Yes, it is my understanding that largely speaking, a high percentage of guns that are used in criminal activity are coming from people who obtained them illegally and had criminal records themselves.
So they've already been very ineffective at disarming criminals and madmen and terrorists. The other argument here is, well, nobody has a legitimate use for an AR-15, and I think you made a very good point that these aren't military weapons. They're designed to look like them, but the actual firing mechanism is the same as those that are used in a wide variety of legitimate hunting and target rifles and pistols. But that said, I'm a gun owner, but I don't own an AR-15 because I don't feel I need one. But I might have a different opinion if I was in the third day in a hurricane disaster zone without power or law enforcement, or if I was a late night clerk in a gang area, or a theater owner who wanted to be able to protect my customers in a crisis, or if I was a border rancher where cartels are operating. Don't I have a right to make that decision for myself under the Second Amendment, rather than have one of my friends on the left make it for me?
Yes, sir, especially with regard to commonly owned semi-automatic firearms that have long been commonly owned by law-abiding citizens for lawful purposes.
The one area where I do agree is we ought to be absolutely outraged by these growing incidents of mass shootings. We didn't have problems like this, certainly not at this magnitude or frequency 50 years ago. So I think it's important to ask what policies have changed in those 50 years that would explain this. And it seems to me there are three. 50 years ago, we used to execute murderers. We've largely stopped doing that now. Could that have something to do with it?
I am not familiar with whatever studies you may be referring to with regard to capital punishment and mass shootings, but I do know that there are bigger factors underlying mass shootings.
We used to put violent criminals in prison until they were old and feeble. Now we have early release programs, sanctuary laws that are releasing dangerous criminals back into our communities. Could that have something to do with it?
With regard to mass public shootings, that's unclear, but with regard to gun crime in particular, it is the case that a lot of gun crime is perpetrated by people with long histories of previously violent behavior.
Most importantly, we used to confine the dangerously mentally ill, when we identified them, in mental hospitals, where we could treat them and prevent them from harming others. In fact, in 1958, my state of California, there were 37,000 mentally ill contained in our mental hospitals. Many were dangers to themselves or to others. Proportionally, that'd be over 100,000 today. But today, we only can find 7,000. The rest of them are on the streets. Could that have something to do with it?
Well, without meaning to come across as demonizing all mentally ill
No, and I
individuals
don't
as
mean
dangerous.
to suggest that all mentally ill
there
people are dangerous, but
of course.
Some mentally ill people are dangerous. Those are the ones that we can find.
Yes, sir. So we've written on this specifically at the Heritage Foundation, and there is a relationship between sort of rates of violence and what we've seen in the mass deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill.
50 years ago, we had very few gun control laws. Today, we have a great many. If these laws were actually the answer to these massacres, shouldn't the problem be getting better and not worse by now?
With regard to mass public shootings, yes, arguably. Though I'd also say gun violence in general is more complex.
I think that should be self-evident. Right. And when you go to a bank, you see an armed guard. And that guard is there to protect our money. Why would anyone object to an armed guard in a school who's there to protect our children?
I'm not sure why anyone would object to protecting our nation's children in the same way that we protect other important places. Though arguably, I mean, we do not want to turn schools into some sort of prison function where people feel that they are, behind bars or something
whenever
like that.
everybody suggested maybe we ought to have a lethal force to protect our children, people go crazy over that, but they don't give a second thought to an armed guard in a bank to protect our money.
So we know that especially with regard to mass public shootings, one of the biggest factors is actually the quickness of the armed response to that shooting. And so that is one of the possible solutions, yes.
Fired, the gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all so much for being here. Your testimony was very powerful. I am perplexed by this argument from the other side that, if I heard it right, that criminals do not follow laws, and therefore, what, we shouldn't have laws? I mean, that statement has no relevance to the existing debate around gun reform because fundamentally, it is completely irrelevant because it is just as meaningless as saying the sky is blue or my microphone is black or the grass is green. Definitionally, criminals don't follow laws. That's what criminals are. So here's the paradox that the other side is putting forward. And I just want to go through it because I think it's important to dismiss this argument for what it is, which is bogus in my opinion. The paradox is this. Law-abiding citizens obey the law, number one. Number two, criminals are lawbreakers, therefore they don't obey the law. Brilliant. Number three, laws impose restrictions on the behavior of only those that follow them. And therefore, number four, laws therefore only hurt law-abiding citizens. Well, that would mean that we shouldn't have any laws at all. Because definitionally, we are making laws based on the kind of society that we imagine. And then we expect that the vast majority of people are going to follow those laws, and the people that don't will then have accountability. So I just think it's a ridiculous argument. I don't understand why the other side keeps putting it forward. The data shows that mass shootings are becoming far more frequent and they're getting deadlier. My colleague, Mr. Deutsch, gave a powerful statement, talked about all the shootings. I wanted to pull out that 16 of the 20 of most deadly mass shootings in modern history occurred in the last 20 years and 8 of them in the last 5 years. But look at the amount of time in each of these shootings. So in 2017, Las Vegas shooting claimed an unprecedented 58 lives and 850 injuries in just 10 minutes. El Paso shooting claimed 22 lives and 24 were injured in less than 6 minutes. Dayton shooting, thank you, Mayor, for being here. The Dayton shooting claimed 9 lives and dozens of injuries in just 30 seconds. All of these by a single shooter who legally purchased semi-automatic weapons and high-capacity magazines. So let me ask you, Mr. Chipman, the Giffords Law Center finds that a person with an assault weapon is able to hurt and kill twice the number of people compared to a shooter with a non-assault rifle or a handgun. Why is that? And think about just average people who are out there who are trying to understand this issue. What are the specific features of an assault weapon that are most dangerous?
Well, let me talk about rifles specifically. When you're firing a round at over 3,000 feet per second, as compared to a handgun, which is usually under 1,000 feet per second. When it hits, it just destroys the body. For instance, I work for Gabby Giffords. She would not have survived had she been shot with a rifle. It's just an entirely different category. So if you mix the speed of the round and then the ability to easily carry 100 rounds in a magazine or 50, and you can fire as quick as the finger can pull, you do battle-like, wounds. And in Las Vegas, the thought 20 years ago that I could have even imagined a shooting where a single gunman could have inflicted 58 deaths and hundreds of people wounded, many of them off-duty law enforcement officers. I mean, it's just hard to imagine. It has everything to do with the capabilities of the weapon.
And just a quick clarifying question. When you said a rifle round, just for people who don't know what that is, explain what happens when the rifle round actually strikes.
Well, then I'd need the help of my dad, the mathematician, and do physics. But just let me say that when a piece of lead is flying at 3,000 feet per second and it hits you, it's a lot different than if it's going at 800 feet per second. So it's just math, and the results are what our surgeon said is just catastrophic.
let me turn to the surgeon. Dr. Heather Scher, who treated victims from the Parkland shooting, wrote that the CT scan of one of the victims of an AR-15 showed an organ that looked like an overripe melon smashed by a sledgehammer. Can you tell us and we have very little time, but can you tell us from your perspective as a doctor, what do you see and what do you experience as you are treating individuals who have had these kinds of wounds?
Like I said, that is accurate from what I've seen in my particular patients. The entire pelvis on the left side had a hole the size of a grapefruit that I had no idea how to repair. I'm not an orthopedic surgeon, but I had intestine coming out of bones. I've never seen that before, and I will never see that again.
Dr. Tovar, thank you so much for everything that you did, and thank you for your service to all of you.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. The horrifying acts of mass violence that our country has witnessed in recent years are totally unacceptable. And as defenders of the Constitution, we cannot tolerate the spread of violence and hatred in our nation. Unfortunately, today's hearing seeks to villainize one of America's most popular firearms instead of looking at real solutions to prevent acts of violence from occurring in our communities. From 1991, when violent crime was at a record high, until 2017, the nation's total violent crime rate decreased 48%. Meanwhile, Americans bought more than 11 million AR-15s during that period. It's clear that the majority's underlying objective in holding this hearing is to rationalize why the federal government should keep guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens. Democrats want to paint the AR-15 as a weapon solely used for war, when in reality, millions of men and women own these firearms and use them lawfully every day. Americans have chosen this modern sporting rifle as their firearm platform of choice for recreational shooting, self-defense, hunting, and educating the next generation about firearms and safety. Our families, our neighbors, and our communities will not become safer if we confiscate firearms from innocent law-abiding people. In fact, by restricting the fundamental freedom that allows people to defend themselves, Democrats will endanger the lives of millions who will no longer be able to adequately protect their families. As members of Congress, it's our duty to ensure that we are protecting the American people by defending this document, the Constitution, and the freedoms that are enumerated in it. Our republic was founded on the principle that government will not impede on these rights, and we must uphold that here in this committee. So I'll ask Ms. Swearer if there's anything that was said today that you would like to respond to at this point.
Thank you, Congressman. There's been a lot that I wish we had the time to respond to, but I'll take just a couple of these in order. I think there's this sort of misunderstanding that, if we can just get rid of AR-15s, that somehow this is going to result in this massive reduction in gun violence deaths. And again, it dramatically misunderstands the underlying factors of gun violence in this country. 2/3 of gun deaths are suicides. That doesn't matter, frankly, whether you have an AR-15, which is rarely used in suicide, or a handgun or a shotgun. It's essentially irrelevant if you just replace the firearm. When we're talking about mass public shootings, we're talking about something that I think we all agree is devastating to communities, but it is a fraction of a percent of gun deaths every year. And we're talking about, switching out the same caliber rifle for something that is the same caliber in a different rifle, but now just doesn't have a barrel shroud or a pistol grip, and saying that this somehow is going to save this large number of lives every year. We're looking at the wrong problems, and so we're coming up with the wrong solutions. I mean, these are things that, even if fully effective and not substituted with other types of firearms, we're talking about a bare minimum of actually impacting rates of gun violence. We have to be looking at more meaningful factors than things like pistol grips. And that's something we can work on together if we would stop looking at scary features.
Ms. Mueller, would you like to respond to anything that was said?
Yeah, thank you. I understand everybody in this room wants to make a difference and that we want to be safe. We want to be safe. Firearms owners want to be safe. And I hope you heard in my oral and my written testimony that the firearms industry is driving solutions. And if you are really interested in having that conversation. That's why I formed the DC Project, is to come and make relationships and help you, be a resource for, let's go to the range and let's really understand what those firearms are and who that community is and how they use them. Those are your constituents as well. I'll say them again: Eddie Eagle, Project Child Safe, and Kids Safe Foundation. Those are teaching your kids how to responsibly look at firearms. Doesn't mean they have to shoot them, but they need to know that it's just like a swimming pool. You teach your kids how to swim. You don't want them to go across a body of water at some point in their life and not know how to live. We're with you. We want you to be with us.
Thank you. Chief Brackney, you said something earlier that gave me pause. I want to give you the chance to amend your statement. When you said any weapon that can be misused to hunt a person should be banned, that applies to all weapons. Is it your contention that all weapons should be banned? And that
The time of the gentleman has expired. The witness may answer the question.
Thank you. I think there's opportunities for quite a few of us to amend our statements, Senator. But yes, weapons that are misused should be considered. And we're looking at percentages of individuals that are injured based on weapons. The fact that we're willing to boil it down to simple numbers when it's actual lives, and to say that it's a percentage of, or a consideration of a percentage of, we actually should be ashamed that we're willing to sacrifice the lives of individuals for data points. I think we should all be able to come over
anyone
to
in
Charlottesville
to have a weapon?
Actually, had we banned or been able to ban some of the assault weapons coming into Charlottesville, I think we could have had a very, very better response from law enforcement, or even Virginia Beach.
All weapons?
Thank you.
Gentlemen, the time of the gentleman has expired. The gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. I'm going to try to get my thoughts together because I've been pretty amazed at some of the things that I've heard, particularly from the other side of the aisle. Mayor Whaley, thank you for being here on behalf of the people that you represent. You're doing exactly what we would expect you to do as a mayor. I know your chief is here as well. Thank you, Chief, for what you and the men and women that you represent do as well. I was a law enforcement officer. I spent 27 years. Gun owner. My father was a hunter. I'm from Orlando. We're 49 people. We've heard a lot about law-abiding citizens. Those 49 people who were in a nightclub that night were law-abiding citizens, and they were not protected. 49 of them lost their lives. 53 others were injured and will never be the same, and that does not include those with invisible wounds. One of my biggest fears as a police chief was worrying about the men and women who do the job going home at the end of the night, because if we can't protect them, if they're at risk, then we know the average citizen is at risk. I always knew they were going to be outmanned, because law enforcement always is, but I certainly worried about them being outgunned. I've gone to more than my share of law enforcement officers' funerals. We've got to do something about the number of mass shootings that has occurred in a country that we say is the greatest country in the world, a country where we say life first, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle have offered nothing as a solution. I'm interested in hearing more, Ms. Mueller, about your program. I wasn't familiar with that. Chief Brackney and Ms. Rand, you said that assault weapons account for 1 in 4, 1 in 5 officers killed in the line of duty. It appears that we love our law enforcement officers until it comes to banning weapons that can blow a hole in them the size of a grapefruit, rounds that can penetrate their ballistic vests. Chief Brackney, I'd just like for you to talk a little bit about the men and women that you command, the burden of keeping them safe, and really, why are you here today?
Thank you, and I appreciate your service as well. For me, personally, having experienced 3 officers die in Pittsburgh by an assault weapon, knowing there was nothing we could do to protect them, knowing that one of our officers was lying there at that point in time, saying over the air that he loved his wife, to let her know that was his only love. He loved his children, knowing he was going to die. And we could not get to him for hours as he lay there dying and bleeding out as a result of that tragedy. I'm here because, as we know, Charlottesville experienced tragedy at the hands of hate. And when you have the type of weapons that can be brought into a community that can devastate an entire community, I actually would be ashamed of any former law enforcement officer who said, I will refuse to comply with a law that they were uphold or swore to uphold themselves. I say to you, and each and every one of you, if you have to go home every night thinking about where your team, where the people who are out there come home alive every day, if you had that burden to bear and you could see the secondary trauma that's enforced upon families, not just the initial trauma, as they look out the doors to see if their parents are coming home, whatever that person is who's willing to give their life for a stranger. We talk about what greater love is that. We don't ever amend or talk about that we've restricted your First Amendment rights. You can't say anything at any time.
Saying no right is absolute.
Right. That's right. So if we are willing
anything, anywhere, anytime.
That's exactly right. And if we're willing to amend what you can say, why wouldn't we consider what you can amend that could cause a type of devastation in each and every one of our communities? So I just thank you even just for the opportunity to be heard today.
Thank you so much, Chief. Thank you to all of you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It says arms, plural, not certain types of arms. It says arms. And I stand by the Constitution and I stand by the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment has absolutely nothing to do with hunting, although there's been a lot of talk today about hunting and hunting rifles. And it has everything to do with your constitutional right to defend yourself, your family, and others. This is step number 1, and the Democrats plan to take away your guns. Step 1, ban a certain type of firearm that no one can properly define today. I have still not heard a proper definition of what it is that we're talking about banning. Step number 2, now that we've taken your semi-automatic rifles away, now we will take your semi-automatic handguns away. Step number 3, now that we've taken all your guns and the government only has their guns, now we've turned into Venezuela and Cuba. There is absolutely no difference in the functionality of an AR-15 and a semi-automatic handgun. None. Absolutely no difference. And we heard the ATF individual talk about as fast as you depress the trigger is as fast as a round comes out. As fast as you depress a trigger on an AR-15 is as fast as a round come out. As fast as you depress a trigger on a semi-automatic handgun is as fast as a round comes out. The weapon I was issued when I did serve in armed conflict was much different than what is available commercially today. The M4 that I was issued in the United States Army in service of Operation Iraqi Freedom had a selector switch on it for 3-round burst and fully automatic. That weapon of war, which is the terminology that the left likes to use, is not available to the general public. The general public cannot go and buy the weapon that I was issued when I served in Operation Iraqi Freedom. And this term assault rifle is a fiction. It doesn't exist. AR stands for Armor Light, which is the company that actually manufactured the original AR-15. There is no such thing as an assault rifle. Just like if I threw my cup at somebody here and it killed them, that would be an assault cup. If I use my truck to run somebody over, I guess that would be an assault truck. So we're using a fiction to demonize a certain type of weapon. So Chief Brackney, I have a question. Isn't it true that an AR-15 discharges a round every time that you depress the trigger? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And is it also correct that every time that you depress the trigger of your service revolver, that a round is dispersed? Is that correct?
Yes, based on the social contract and the social compact that I have with society to police society, that is correct that when I discharge my weapon, that does occur.
So it's your testimony here today that the functionality of an AR-15 and the functionality of a semi-automatic handgun is identical because The moment you depress the trigger, a round comes out of the weapon. Is that correct?
In the purest sense, yes, when you're pulling that, absolutely in the purest sense. When we're talking about the targets and the behaviors and the impact of those, it is very different than the functionality. That is correct.
I'm talking about the functionality, and that's what you all are talking about, is the functionality of an AR-15. So that's what we're talking about. And you said that and I was in here when you said this, and correct me if I'm misstating, and we can have the reporter read back exactly what you said verbatim if you would like. You said that anything used to hunt people should be banned. Is that correct?
Any weapon that can be used to hunt individuals should be banned.
Okay, so you then stand for the proposition to ban any type of firearm, because any type of firearm could be used to misuse and kill people.
As I stated before, with law enforcement in particular, there is a social contract that we have.
No, I'm asking, based on your statement, you said that anything used to hunt people should be banned. That's what you stated. You just said all, so I'm clarifying. Your statement today is that all firearms, because they can be used to hunt people, should be banned. That's your statement before this committee.
So that is not my statement. So you haven't clarified my statement, sir. You've just added a statement for me. So again.
Why don't you clarify exactly what you said, and we can take a break and have the clerk read back exactly what you stated, because I wrote down, you said anything used to hunt people should be banned. And it's my understanding that any firearm can be used.
Point of order.
The gentleman will suspend, the gentlelady will state a point of order.
I was in a hearing yesterday in the Judiciary Committee, the Subcommittee for Immigration, where one of my colleagues from the minority side stated that it is not right to attack a witness that comes forth in the manner that Mr. Stubbe has been, incriminating and attacking our law enforcement officer here. So if he could just please tone down his words.
Is there a point of order, Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman controls the time.
No, I had 32 seconds when she asked for a point of order. I would ask for that time to be put back on the.
If you want to be so strict, we'll get 7 seconds back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you support banning all firearms or anything used to be able to hunt people, is that correct?
Sir, you're actually conflating two. You just said support banning firearms or anything that could use to be hunt or that could hunt people. That was not my statement.
What was your statement then?
My statement was, and please, I don't have it as verbatim as possibly that you do, that I do support weapons that are used to hunt people, that they be banned.
So any type of weapon that can be used to hunt people should be banned, is your statement.
Go ahead, answer the question.
Could he repeat that? The gavel was going off at the exact same time.
Question, please.
Any type of weapon, which is what you just stated, any type of weapon that can be used to kill people should be banned.
Sir, you're adding the word type. I said any weapons. So that's my answer. So thank you.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this very important hearing that many of us have been waiting for. And to all the families and those who are here that have lost loved ones, thank you for being here. I know that every time that you have to sit and listen to this kind of testimony and the back and forth, it brings back so many memories. And please know that we feel your pain and we are getting ready to do something about it. I know that earlier one of my colleagues said that the Democrats, even if it's wrong, we have to do something. And I'm here to tell you that what we're doing is right. It's not only right for us to do it, I think our country demands it. Everywhere I go, this issue comes up, whether it's a town hall meeting with veterans or a town hall meeting with seniors. Everybody is concerned about gun violence, and not just with these type of weapons, but any weapon. I grew up poor on a farm in South Texas. I was taught to use a rifle and a shotgun at an early age. Both were used for hunting to put food on the table, or were always ready to protect us and protect our property. I still, in fact, keep a shotgun at my home. Fortunately, I've never had to use it. To me, that's what guns are for hunting and protecting our property. You don't need a weapon that kills 9 to 10 people in 30 seconds to go hunting to put food on the table. And you don't need that either to protect your property. So assault weapons are, frankly, in my view, just for killing people. Weapons are designed to effectively and efficiently kill as many as possible, frankly, are posing the greatest threat to us today. We in Texas have suffered from this, as many other states have, and it's time for all of us to act. I support the bill that Mr. Cicilline has before us, and frankly, sometimes I think it needs to be even stronger. So Mr. Chipman, I want to start with you. In your written testimony, that you say that one other option might be to have the registration of all existing assault weapons under the NFA while banning the future manufacturers and sale of these firearms. Is that a position from you or the organization and or all the other gun violence groups in accordance with this position?
It's the position of Giffords, based on my 25 years of experience. I don't want to speak for other organizations about that, but it's based on my experience that a law, the NFA, was meant to keep the most dangerous weapons out of criminal hands, and it's working. Only 3 out of every 1,000 crime guns traced by ATF is a machine gun. So laws work. And so if we want to focus on other types of weapons, I would suggest we have a time-tested law that's been on our books since the 1930s. Let's take that approach.
And what is your position on the buyback programs?
I think that we should be looking to America, not Australia, for solutions. And as I said, the NFA was passed at a time where we had a similar problem.
Right.
Very lethal weapons. And so I would suggest that it's a balance that would honor the rights of people who have these guns, to keep them if they were properly regulated, and understood that there's so many of them out there that, like machine guns, it would prevent them from being manufactured and sold in the future. And I think that strikes a reasonable balance between the rights of individuals and the rights of all Americans, a human right not to get shot.
Well, I wanted to put another idea that came really from a senior at a senior town hall meeting that I had in my district a couple of weeks ago. And although it was about senior issues, Social Security, Medicare, she approached me after the meeting with a list. And frankly, she has about 6 or 7 suggestions, but one caught my eye and I just wanted your reaction to it. She thinks we should place a chip when you make them, in other words, at manufacturing, inside those giant guns, and she was referring to the assault weapons, so that they can be tracked, so that we know where they are, or if an incident, to maybe stop an incident before it happens, to do something proactively. Have you all ever looked at an idea like that?
I don't think we've looked at an idea like that. One of the challenges for law enforcement, though, is when you recover a firearm in a crime, it's very useful to know who owns it. And so the ability to trace a gun, the ability to take shell casings that are often left at a crime scene and be able to tie those back to a gun and the shooter are very useful. I think with a chip in all guns, the reality is most guns are lawfully owned. And so that's a lot of data we don't need. I'd be more focused on what can help cops solve gun crime quickly and immediately.
Well, thank you for your thoughts, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I've heard a number of my colleagues today say that they're strong supporters of the Second Amendment. I think a couple of the witnesses also articulated the same sentiment. I want to say I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment too, as properly interpreted by the Supreme Court in Heller versus District of Columbia, which says that the Second Amendment gives you a right to a handgun for purposes of self-defense and a rifle for purposes of hunting and recreation, but nowhere does it give you a right to weapons of war, machine guns, armored tanks, or anything like that. Is there anybody on the panel who disagrees with that? Is there anyone who believes that the Second Amendment gives you a right to own a machine gun? No, okay. Is there anyone who thinks it gives you the right to own an armored tank? Ms. Mueller, please.
Yes, sir.
You think it gives you the right to a tank? Does it give you a right to nuclear weapons?
Well, you started out with machine gun, and we can legally own machine guns if we go through the rich man's game of the NFA.
So you're for unrestricted access to machine guns then?
I would look at that, yes. I would look at taking those off the NFA.
Do you agree with that, Ms. Swear? Do you think there's a constitutional right to own a machine gun?
I believe there is a constitutional right to own what the equivalent of the same sort of functions of a musket would be, just as we've expanded the First Amendment to include technological advancements. We include the same sorts of things with the Second Amendment. So it would include, I think the Supreme Court has found the proper phrasing there to say commonly owned for law-abiding purposes. So it's essentially this function of, is it useful for law-abiding purposes? And the answer for a lot of these things is yes.
Okay, I just want to be clear. So both of you say that people should be allowed to purchase machine guns the same way they should be allowed to purchase AR-15s, which is the same way they should be allowed to purchase handguns.
My distinction with actual fully automatic weapons might be a bit different.
Okay,
but
well,
yes.
let me go on because I do have other questions. I appreciate that. Dr. Tovar, you're from El Paso. Your testimony was stunning to me. There's something you said that will haunt me for a long time, and I want you to elaborate it. You were called back. You were supposed to be going home that night. You were called back after the massacre took place to try to save people. And as I understand, you helped save, and your colleagues helped save more than a dozen people. Is that right?
Yes, it was a large team effort.
But you lost one person who was, I guess, the first patient that you worked on, and you said that you will always carry the guilt of that with you. And I remembered a passage I once read from Rousseau, who said how often audacity and pride are on the side of the guilty, and how often shame and guilt are on the side of the innocent. And I wonder why you would feel guilty for trying to save someone's life who was assassinated by an assault weapon that you had nothing to do with being in the hands of a criminal.
I felt guilty, and I still feel that I could have done more. I wanted to do more. But the fact is, I had 10 patients there and reports of maybe up to 20, 40 patients. I had no idea. And I couldn't spend as much time as I wanted to on that one patient when I knew I had 20 or 30 coming in.
Are you still practicing now in El Paso?
Yes.
How do you feel about the possibility of selling people some machine guns or heavier weaponry under their so-called Second Amendment rights?
I would not agree with that, but the Second Amendment stands.
Yeah. It's been misrepresented, it's been distorted, and the National Rifle Association used to be a moderate mainstream organization that supported gun safety regulation. Then it was taken over, hijacked for political purposes, and the idea was to oppose all gun safety regulation, to try to drive a wedge between the rural parts of America and the metropolitan parts of America. And that's worked like a dream from an electoral standpoint. Congratulations, you guys. But we have casualties on the streets of America in every city and town. These are our people. These are American citizens who are being shot down by these weapons of war, which you think the Second Amendment covers, but the Supreme Court doesn't. Ms. Mueller, you said something before about how I think you had friends in the military who don't prefer the AR-15. Tell me if I got this right, because they want something with greater stopping power. Will you explain what that means?
Yeah. Yes, sir. They were saying that, it's their job in war, in combat, to kill people. And they were telling me, relating that it's not an effective round. And that,
what does it mean not to have enough? What you said before, I think, was they preferred a weapon with greater stopping power.
Correct.
I don't know that phrase. Will you explain that to me?
Gentleman's time has expired. The witness may answer the question.
stopping power is stopping a threat. If this person needed to be killed, that the 223 was not a good round to do that.
So in other words, the weapons that killed in El Paso or Dayton did not have enough explosive force? Is that it?
Correct.
Okay, I yield back, Mr.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Nagus, from Colorado, for yielding to me for a few moments to go first. And I want to thank all of our witnesses that are here today. Most definitely, I want to thank our survivors, their families, and all the GVP activists that are taking their time to be here to discuss this important issue. I first want to underscore that the current prevalence of assault weapons was the result of not of action, but of inaction. Congress did not end the assault weapons ban by lifting it, but by simply allowing it to expire. And I believe that inaction has most definitely cost lives. Tragically, we have seen extremely little action to address gun violence in the past several decades. I'm pleased to be part of this present moment in which we are finally having hearings like this to illuminate the multifaceted problem of gun violence. No single measure will end this epidemic, but we know that there are bills that will save lives. The House has already passed some of those. Universal background checks, closing the Charleston loophole, and we are continuing to explore other laws too. The House has also passed an appropriations package that funds gun violence prevention research. But time and time again, Senate inaction is maintaining the status quo. It has been over 200 days since the House has passed H.R. 8 to require universal background checks. And in that 200 days, the Senate has done nothing. The House voted to provide a historic $50 million package to fund gun violence research, but a Senate proposal instead recommends nothing. Americans are paying for Senate inaction with their lives. We lose another 100 people to gun violence every single day. Every day, 100 families face a new and terrible loss. And inaction is absolutely unacceptable. And I'd like to say for anyone on this panel, unless you have experienced gun violence, you have no idea the burden of loved ones lost and the burden that that has on their families and their communities. Dr. Brackney, how did the expiration of the assault weapons ban affect law enforcement?
Thank you. I am in complete agreement with you. When we are too cowardly to face issues and instead let them to expire like we would milk in our refrigerator versus taking some sort of action. As we know in any other field, think about the medical field, there's often incremental steps that we take in order to create medications to address cancer. We don't say until we have the cure, we do nothing. And we're doing something very similar when it comes to law enforcement. The attacks on law enforcement, the ambushes on law enforcement have increased. People have been emboldened by the fact that not only do they have the weapon and the capacity to do that, but there's the prevalence of which they can get these weapons. There's now also the ghost weapons in which you buy pieces and parts of it so that you can get around, again, legislation when it comes to what you must be required to do in order to obtain a weapon legally. This is an absolute atrocity, and I've attended those funerals of officers over the 35 years that I've been in law enforcement, the more than 3 decades plus that I've been in law enforcement. And it continues to hold a pit in your stomach for every person that you see that has lost a life, but also it moves concentrically outward. It affects an entire nation. The last shootings that we can remember in Dayton, it stopped the country and we held our breath for literally days. And then we've forgotten about the shooting that occurred just before it, and probably will forget about the next one as well.
Thank you. And Ms. Rand, we know that assault weapons are the weapons of choice for mass shooters. What do we know about why they choose these weapons?
Well, I think that the firepower that assault weapons affords a shooter gives them more bravery. They feel like they can outgun law enforcement. And I would go back to the example that was offered about Columbine, that it's a little known fact. There were armed guards at Columbine who engaged in fire with Harris and Klebold, but were unable to stop them because they were outgunned by the assailants' assault weapons. So I think it provides them with a sense of bravery that they wouldn't otherwise have. They know they can confront law enforcement. They know they can kill a number of people very quickly. And, you know, I think also if you look at the marketing of these weapons, they're sold using militarized imagery. And now we're seeing assailants who copy that. They come with body armor.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and of course, thank you to my colleague, Ms. Macbeth, who always speaks truth to power in such an incredible way. Chief Brackney, you mentioned this a minute ago, but I just want to give you a chance to expound on it a bit further. How long have you been in law enforcement?
Thank you. A woman shouldn't tell her age, but 35 years, and maybe they hired me when I was really young.
And how long have you been chief?
So I've been the chief of Charlottesville now for just about 15 months. I was a chief in George Washington University 3 years prior to that, and 31, just short of 31 years with the city of Pittsburgh, commanding our SWAT teams, major crimes, et cetera.
Well, thank you for your service. And the reason why I asked that, my colleague from Florida on this side of the aisle, I thought was right to point out during her parliamentary inquiry or point of order request. I took umbrage at the way in which my colleague interacted with you in the prior exchange, that someone of your caliber and someone who has served your community and your country, who is here today to testify on the importance of us taking common sense steps to prevent the pervasive gun violence that's ravaging communities across our country. I did not think that that exchange was reflective of the way in which this committee and its members ought to conduct itself. And so I thank you again for being here today and for your testimony. I also, of course, would associate myself with the remarks of my esteemed colleague from Georgia. Military-style assault weapons have no place in civilian hands, in my view. They have no place in schools, in theaters, and in communities. And in Colorado, we know this all too well. I happen to represent the great state of Colorado, and we lived through Columbine 20 years ago, where 13 individuals were killed in a matter of 16 minutes. We grieved after Aurora, where 12 people were killed and 58 others injured. Military-style assault weapons are designed to kill people quickly and efficiently. And large-capacity magazines are often the choice for mass shooters because they allow the shooter to fire a large number of rounds and quickly reload. Inaction on this issue, as so many of my colleagues have said and as so many of the witnesses have attested to, it is putting our students, our children, and our community in harm's way. And I, for one, believe that we cannot allow it. When we see mass shootings in the news every single month, we know that it is time to act. We owe it to those we have lost and to the survivors, some of whom are here in the audience today, the survivors of Columbine, of Aurora, of Las Vegas, of Orlando, of Newtown, of Sutherland Springs, of Parkland, of El Paso. We owe it to them. And I am grateful to the chairman and to my colleagues for holding this hearing so that we can take action. I will say the difference between my home state and Congress is that Colorado had the courage to act. In Colorado, we passed a high-capacity magazine ban in 2013 as part of a broad attempt to reform gun laws following the Aurora Theater shooting the year before. It is past time for Congress to take up these same reforms, and I'm so grateful to be able to support the proposal that we've talked about today in terms of banning assault weapons. So my question, Mr. Chipman, I first thank you for your service and as a law enforcement officer for putting your life on the line. I know, given your experience, that you've used these weapons that we're speaking of today. Why do you believe it's important that we have a conversation now about assault weapons, and what about your experiences have led you to believe that we need reform?
Because they're getting more lethal, and we should have had this conversation decades ago. The firearms industry continues to make more lethal firearms, and Congress is not keeping up with technology. We see that in now smaller weaponry, like my panel member likes to have because it's easy to carry around in her car. But it was used to kill a Milwaukee police officer because it was able to defeat his bulletproof vest. So to me, We should not tip the scales on the side of just convenience, but of our right to live in a country absent the fear of getting shot and killed in the line of duty or at a movie theater or just, in your daily affairs.
With that, I see my time is close to expiring, Mr. Chairman, so I will just again say thank you to the chairman and to the witnesses today for appearing and for your testimony. We appreciate it.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean. Oh, no? I'm sorry, the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar.
Thank you so much, Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Dean, so much for switching with me. I want to thank everyone here, people who traveled to be here with us today at this very important hearing, people who stood in a long line for a long time in order to get in. I want to thank our panel. I want to especially thank the panelist who is my constituent, Dr. Alex Rios Tovar. Thank you for being here. Thank you for everything you did to save so many lives. As we have heard today, there are far too many people on this Judiciary Committee who represent communities that have been impacted by gun violence. And my community, El Paso, Texas, is unfortunately now part of that very sad and tragic club. On the day of the shooting, August 3rd, I received many calls from colleagues who knew only too well what we were going through in El Paso. And the very next day, Dayton entered that awful club, and days later, Odessa entered that awful club. And part of why I invited you, Dr. Rios Tovar, to come here, part of why I wanted the American people and the Congress to hear your testimony is because too often we don't understand what happens literally to people who are shot up by these weapons of mass destruction. And I want to say something before I ask you the question I'm about to ask you. But that day on August 3rd, El Paso was a victim not just of the gun violence epidemic, but we were also a victim to the hate epidemic of this country. And last week, we passed legislation, we marked up legislation out of this committee that began to address that hate epidemic. And it was shocking to me that some of the people who use the language that fuels that hate epidemic were wondering why we needed to pass laws about the hate epidemic. But as long as we have people pushing that language and that racism, we will need laws that protect communities like mine. And as long as we have people who say, I deserve to have a weapon of mass destruction so that I can shoot critters, as we've heard today, or so that I can have an accessory like shoes, as we've heard today, then we will continue to see massacres and bloodshed. But we're here today to create change so that communities like mine will not have to endure what we endured, because the consequence is long-lasting. Dr. Rios Tovar, you've told us about what you witnessed that day, what you lived through that day. Can you share with us what you emotionally and mentally still live with today as a first responder in healthcare?
Thank you for that question. I'm not embarrassed to say that that Sunday, I bawled like a child for half an hour. I went through the Facebook page of one of those victims and saw that that baby is going to live without parents. Is an orphan now. And that week, once my patients were extubated, no longer on the ventilator, they had at least a week of nightmares. They would wake up in the middle of the night while I was there on call. And I hear from nurses, I see it myself, the nightmares that they would awaken from. I haven't been able to sleep for the past 2 months since this tragic event happened. And I encourage all those that are affected by a tragedy like this to go and seek counseling, because it's important to recognize that not just the victims and the victims' families, but those first responders, even those that are not present. There's a lot of guilt that comes to providers who were not available to respond because they feel like they should have been there to help out as well. So there's a lot of room for therapy and for counseling for the entire community. And I think it's very helpful.
Dr. Rios-Tovar, thank you so much for everything you did to save all the lives and to touch all the lives that you did. You're a hero. All of these deaths and all of this pain was needless, and we can change that today. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank all of the testifiers and the advocates for being here. And I thank the advocates or the testifiers for the minority because you proved how weak your argument is. Mr. Chairman, I wanted to take a look at, and if I could have a slide brought up, a little bit of the history of this conversation and where this country stood. Take a look, and I quote, "We are writing to urge your support for a ban on the domestic manufacture of military-style assault weapons. Statistics prove that we can dry up the supply of these guns, making them less accessible to criminals. We urge you to listen to the American public and to law enforcement and support a ban on the further manufacture of these weapons. Sincerely, Gerald R. Ford, Jimmy Carter, and Ronald Reagan." This should not be a political issue. In 2004, we had the opportunity to save even more lives by reauthorizing the ban. Even George W. Bush favored an extension of this life-saving law. Would you play the clip? Sorry, I guess we don't have it. Could you hold the clock? Is that possible? Do we have the clip? It is a clip of President George W. Bush. I see we're having a problem with the volume. Oh, there we go.
My view is clear. I did think we ought to extend the assault weapons ban.
Unfortunately, President George W. Bush was not able to persuade enough of his Republican colleagues, and the ban expired through inaction. This should not be a political debate. I'll tell you what has changed and what has made it a political debate among politicians only, not among Americans. More than 500,000 Americans have died from gun violence. America has suffered more than 300 mass shootings per year. The NRA ramped up its lobbying of Republican members on this very committee, 17 of who the NRA spent spending a record $54 million in 2016 elections alone. And every single member of the Republican side of this dais has accepted campaign contributions and other support to a total of $1.2 million total. We know now that no atrocity convinces our Republican colleagues to reject NRA funding and to do what is right. Not Sandy Hook, not Parkland, not Las Vegas, not Tree of Life, not El Paso, not Dayton, and I could go on and on. One party has made this a priority, and it is us. It shouldn't be us alone. It is a question of our common humanity. I'm a mother and a grandmother, so I'll ask a couple of quick questions if I may. I'd like to start with Mr. Chipman. How does a pistol grip and barrel shroud make it more likely a mass shooter will be able to kill many people?
Well, as Senator Cruz has demonstrated, a barrel of an AR-15 can get really hot if you try to cook bacon on it. So imagine if you're a determined killer and you're firing hundreds of rounds. This would allow you to grip the firearm in a way that would increase your ability to spray fire and kill more people.
To hold on to this hot weapon. So
Yes.
you can maximize the lethality. Mr. Chipman, can you provide us your thoughts on the threat to law enforcement, since you've been on both sides?
The single biggest threat is how common now rifle rounds have been instituted in now handguns. Traditionally, law enforcement were wearing vests to protect themselves from handguns that fired handgun ammunition. But that wasn't enough. The industry purposely has now created weaponry to defeat bulletproof vests, and that's the biggest threat. There's a bill that actually Ms. Demings has presented that tries to address this. And we saw it already this year in Milwaukee, where an officer executing a warrant has got his vest on, but the shooter has an AK pistol and it defeats it.
I thank you, and I'll end with this thought. I am a mother, I'm a grandmother to a second grader, and I have 2 grandchildren coming this year. So it is through that lens that I take a look at, please, would you please roll the tape? This is a question of our common humanity. We have crossed a threshold no country should have ever crossed. Please play the tape.
This year, my mom got me the perfect bag for back to school.
These colorful binders help me stay organized.
These headphones are just what I need for studying.
These new sneakers are just what I need for the new year.
This jacket is a real must-have.
My parents got me the skateboard I wanted. It's pretty cool.
These scissors really come in handy in art class. These colored pencils, too. These new socks? They can be a real lifesaver.
I finally got my own phone to stay in touch with my mom.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back, but we will not.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
I apologize. Thank you, Mr. Nadler, Chairman. That video is very difficult to watch because I'm also a mother and I lost my father to gun violence. And today, this morning, I answered the phone right when the hearing started, and the school was conducting an active shooter drill. And my daughter, who just turned 11 years old, tells me that if she gets locked out of her classroom, if she's going to, if she can't get into the classroom, she would try to talk to the shooter and tell him or her to remember his little brother or sister to not shoot. This is what our children now have to live with. I wasn't planning on starting my testimony with that story, but I want to share a quote that I received from one of my constituents. He's an ER doctor. He works in the Homestead Baptist Health System, Dr. Woltansky. He told me that, quote, assault weapons do a tremendous amount of damage to the human body. The tissue damage and destruction is exponentially worse than a conventional handgun. From the carnage that he's personally witnessed, he says that assault weapons, quote, are not defensive weapons. They are offensive weapons designed to inflict death, tissue damage, and devastation on the human body. And that's what they do very effectively, end quote. That is clearly what military-style weapons are designed for. We've seen these weapons of war being used in places like Iraq, in Afghanistan, and they are now being used in our very own communities, taking the lives of our children, our parents, our brothers, our sisters. It has to stop. And there's something that we can do here in Congress today. And Ms. Mueller, you said earlier, which really struck me, you said, you know, you were describing a gun and you said, I love this little gun. It's time to love our children more. We have to take action. That is why we're having this hearing today, because there is a way to protect our children and our communities. And it's by passing stricter gun laws. I'm not done here.
With me?
No, please. In Florida, the pain of losing our loved ones strikes home, very close to home, close to my district. We've had 2 recent mass shootings that resulted in 65 deaths, 65 people that lost their lives. In Parkland, last Valentine's Day, on February 14th, a shooter using an AR-15 style rifle opened fire on high school students that day. And in 6 minutes, the shooter with his assault weapon killed 17 people, 17 kids, including a coach, injured 17 others. In 2016, at Pulse nightclub in Orlando, a shooter using another military-style rifle fired into a crowd. With the assault weapon, he killed 49 people and injured 53 others in a matter of minutes. And in the Pulse nightclub that night was Jerry Wright, the son of my very good friends, Fred and MJ Wright. He was a wonderful, loving, caring son. He was there to have a good time, to enjoy Latin music that night. And his life was cruelly taken. He was only 31 years old. And I know that MJ and Fred live with that pain every single day. Jerry didn't deserve this. His parents didn't deserve this. But because the shooter was able to obtain that military-style rifle, he delivered a devastating fate to the Wright family that day. These are weapons of war, period, full stop. They don't belong in our communities. Now, I want to ask Dr. Rios Tovar. I've spoken to doctors in my district who have described these terrible injuries. Can you just elaborate what a gunshot wound from an assault rifle looks like compared to that of a handgun?
Like I said earlier, these types of injuries, you can't necessarily see on the outside. That one victim that perished had a single gunshot to the back and out the clavicular area. It looks like a simple through and through, not so much going on. But once that autopsy was done, we saw that a hole the size of my fist was through her lung, the apex of the lung. And there's nothing I can do from that point.
Hired. Thank all of our members, and as I think the witnesses can see, the deepness of the passion permeates so many of us. I've been in the United States Congress for 24 years, and that means that I have a lot of personal wounds that do not in any way reflect the victims of gun violence who lost their lives. But I was here for Columbine, when so many said that we were going to do something. Let me read this into the record. Between September 25th and October 1st, the day of the shooting, he stockpiled an arsenal of weapons, associated equipment, and ammunition that included 14 AR-15 rifles, all of which were equipped with bump stocks, 12 of which had 100-round magazines, 8 had AR-10 rifles, a bolt-action rifle, and a revolver. A bump stock modifies a semi-automatic weapon so they can shoot in rapid succession, mimicking automatic fire. Mayor, thank you. You're on the ground. Tell us what might have happened if your officers had not ran into face of danger. I have a lot of questions, and so I welcome you going right to it because we know it. I want the record to have it, to know how they saved lives, but how they had to run directly in danger.
Thank you, Representative. The 7 officers that ran to stop the shooter in 32 seconds saved countless lives because where they stopped, the shooter was right outside an entryway to a bar that hundreds had already shoved in and had no way of getting out. And if we did not have, as I like to say, 6 good guys with guns,
the amount of damage and death that would have happened could have been in the hundreds.
But you had a bad guy armed with an automatic
Exactly.
weapon.
Exactly. And he's still in 32 seconds, even with those officers there, killed 9 and injured dozens more.
Thank you. You're here supporting a ban on assault weapons?
Yes, ma'am.
Chief, you heard me describe what the shooter in Las Vegas had mounted on a post, almost like he was in war, on a mountain, hiding so that those who were making their way up would be in the range of danger. Tell me what, in God's name, one could imagine that any civilian needed those weapons, which resulted in 58 dead and the danger and loss of life, even of law enforcement, who had to run toward that danger.
Absolutely. What he had was the ability to literally inflict the most amount of damage and be stable doing it. It's kind of hard to hold a weapon indefinitely. The weight starts to get to you, but when you have the stabilizers and all the other things that assist you, you can do that for a very long time. And when you want to talk about running towards danger, 5 officers were shot as they ran into the tree of life, attempting to disarm and neutralize the individual who then had killed 11 people at that point.
Had an automatic weapon.
He had one of those as part of those. He used predominantly that his handgun there.
But he was armed with such that he could continue.
That is exactly correct. That he had done the type of damage that he had done. Absolutely.
You're an MD as well?
Oh, no, that's the distinguished one, PhD.
All right, you're a PhD.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, we are grateful for your service with that knowledge as chief. Let me go to Dr. Rios Tovar, and let me offer you my sympathy. I'm a Texan. I came to El Paso. I saw some of your mastery in those who were alive. I visited victims in both of the hospitals who had those heinous shots, and I saw the personal wounds of their spirit, but as well the physical wounds. So let me pose this for my good friends. I welcome the opposition testimony. That's what it is. I respect them because they're Americans. I am adamantly against an assault weapons. I believe in a buyback. I have no shame in that. And I believe that we can do this as Americans. I asked the National Rifle Association to stand with Americans. But let me give you this picture. Sandy Hook and the babies from 6 and 7 years old were shot with an automatic weapon. Babies, first graders. I'm sorry to ask you this. What kind of wound would a child's body receive from an AR-15 or an automatic weapon? You saw adults, and I'm not sure if you saw a child. I know someone was wounded. But tell me about the size of the body, the mass of the body, and that bullet going into a child.
It's not something I would even want to think about imagining, but it would just be devastating. It's not something I can answer. I'm sorry.
It would be worse than you could imagine. And what it would be is a adult having a cavity. You were trying to explain to us, that's big holes in the body. Is that not right?
That's correct.
And so the mass of an adult is 1 or 2 or 3 times that of a child. I'm not a physician. So in the essence of a child, maybe the child physically would not be able to be contained. Trying to put it in as...
It would just be too horrific to describe.
These are the assault weapons that we are here today trying to ban. To the witnesses, to Mr. Chipman, let me thank you. I did not ask you, but I'm familiar with the National Firearm Act, and I think it can be a source of amendment for many of our legislative initiatives. I do believe in the enforcing of legislation in terms of gun trafficking, which makes some of our cities like Chicago and LA and others victims because the guns are trafficked. But I want to read this into the record as I thank the witnesses. Assault weapons account for 430 or 85% of the total 501 mass shooting fatalities. This is done by a group of doctors. This is research. In a linear regression model controlling for a yearly trend, the federal ban period was associated with a statistically significant 9 fewer mass shootings related per 10,000. Mass shooting fatalities were 70% less likely to occur during the federal ban on assault weapons. The science is clear, the evidence is clear, the murder of our fellow Americans, the loss of life, the victims that are in this audience that have to listen over and over and over again about why we're not acting, we owe them something. This committee is willing to pay the debt. I thank each and every one of you for staying this long and helping us to provide the testimony that will have us write, as we have already done, and pass an assault weapons ban. This concludes today's hearing. We thank all of our witnesses for participating. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. With all of our thanks, without objection, this hearing is now adjourned.
Okay. Thank you. That's very All right, so use the spectrum and then that works good.
And parts of this hearing, actually in its entirety, you can find online, cspan.org, if you missed any of the hearing on gun violence prevention in the U.S. Take you live now to the floor of the House of Commons in London for a statement from British Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
In the government, they